Chapter 315. 2 days later, Fang Xingjian smiled as he looked at the dragon scale. He could sense an extremely sharp and majestic aura sweeping to and fro in his body, exuding waves of curiosity. After another day of temptation, Fang Xingjian handed over half of the rebirth sword technique and finally let the Heaven's Volition sword intent continue to circulate in his body. Although the Heaven's Volition sword intent was still unwilling to be subdued, it was still a great improvement. Fang Xingjian could sense an extremely strong desire to engulf and avarice deep within the Heaven's Volition sword intent. He believed that as long as he continued to use sword techniques to tempt the Heaven's Volition sword intent, he would eventually be able to subdue it and learn the Heaven's Volition sword technique. Just then, the sound of the door being pushed open rang out again. The Heaven's Volition sword intent seemed to be startled and retracted bit by bit. However, this time around, Fang Xingjian could sense that it was reluctant to part with the sword technique in his body. It did not leave so decisively like the first time. Fang Xingjian smiled and allowed the Heaven's Volition sword intent to leave. He turned and saw Sword Saint Sasa walking in. Sasa greeted him as usual. "How is it, Xingjian? Is everything going well? We've already deciphered 50% of the text." Everyone is very motivated. Fang Xingjian shook his head and said nonchalantly, "Is that so? Then you guys might have to waste time. I'll be able to complete this sword technique in at most half a month's time." Sasa's eyes narrowed as he watched coldly as Fang Xingjian left. Seeing how confident Fang Xingjian was, Sasa also felt a sense of urgency. How could he, who was determined to get his hands on the dragon scale, allow Fang Xingjian to be one step ahead of him? I must hurry up. I mustn't let the secret of the dragon's scale fall into the hands of others. I must stop Fang Xingjian from delving deeper. Following that, the experts who were working together with Sasa to analyze the ancient characters walked in while yawning. Most of them were just ordinary knights. Some of them were even commoners. After staying up all night, they were very tired. It was impossible for them to be as spirited as Sasa. He didn't even feel tired at all. Sasa looked at them and said, "What about Jellos and Benjamin? Why aren't they here? They're sick. They've been staying up late for the past few days. They're already in their 60s, and their bodies can't keep up. I have to come even if I can't keep up." Sasa coldly said, "This month's salary will be doubled. From now on, all of you will cancel your rest. In half a month? No, within a week, you must finish analyzing all the ancient language." In an instant, a series of sorrowful cries rang out. One of the experts said, "You're a conferred knight, and you won't have a problem staying up for so long. But for us, there's no way we'll be able to persevere, and it'll even affect our efficiency. Furthermore, you're asking us to explain in sections, so we can't analyze it according to the context. That's why the result is so slow. You should ask us to combine all the sections together." Sasa nodded reluctantly. Time was of the essence. Moreover, after analyzing it for so long, he was basically certain that the secret of the dragon scale was hidden in the sword intent. Even if the people outside knew about the full text, they would not know the secret. Therefore, he said, "Then let's combine the upper text and analyze it together. The results must be out within 3 days." After giving it some thought, he seemed to realize that his demands were really too high. He slowed down and said, "I'll get someone to invite more people over. You guys just need to hang on for this period of time. As long as you guys are able to finish analyzing the dragon scale, I'll guarantee the conditions I promised you guys earlier. I'll also add on a reward of 1,000 gold per person." Hearing this news, everyone present cheered a little. A reward of 1,000 gold was already a huge sum of money. Even Sasa himself felt a little heartache. However, as long as they were able to analyze the full text first, this was an investment that could be tolerated. "Fang Xingjian, this won't do, Xingjian." James shook his head and said, "When we went to investigate, we discovered that the teacher and the 3 students were no longer around. Someone had hidden them. It seems that they're determined to do this. We must be prepared for the worst." Fang Xingjian's brows furrowed deeply. His time was tight, and what he hated the most right now was to spend his time on these messy things. He asked, If they were to report this matter to the association, what would happen? The association keeps a very tight watch on each set of martial techniques that are included in the Knight's Handbook. It's because each set of sword technique might be cultivated by thousands or even tens of thousands of knights and hundreds of thousands or even millions of apprentices. As the saying goes, it's better to kill 1,000 innocents than to let one go. Your rebirth sword technique has also been evaluated by me and the others. It was only after we ascertained that there were no problems that it was included in the Knight's Handbook. Now that a problem has arisen, we're not the only ones affected. They're also in a very passive position. Therefore, the association will act very quickly. They'll first make an announcement to stop all cultivation and experimentation of the rebirth sword technique. Next, they'll ask you to hand over all the relevant information, and they'll conduct questioning and arbitration. If you're unable to prove that there are no problems with the sword technique during the arbitration, the Knight Association will then form a team of experts to conduct a new round of experimentation and evaluation on the entire set of sword technique. If they're unable to ascertain it, they might send out apprentices with different conditions to go through 1, 2, or even 3 rounds of experimental training until they're completely sure that there are no problems. James frowned and sighed. If that's the case, it might take a few years before you can prove your innocence. Even if it's proven in the end, the negative effects it will bring will be irreversible. In the end, there might not even be anyone who would dare to cultivate your rebirth sword technique. Fang Xingjian said, "We can't allow them to continue experimenting and examining it without any restrictions. We must prove that there are no problems with the rebirth sword technique during the arbitration." The most direct and trustworthy way to prove it would naturally be to get a large number of people to cultivate the rebirth sword technique. However, this would take up too much time and resources. It could be said that it was very rare for any sword technique to be proven in such a way. Then for many people who are not sword arts experts, how are they to judge the quality of sword technique? Naturally, they would have to ask a real expert. It was just like the Knight Association's arbitration. On one hand, it would depend on the materials that Fang Xingjian had prepared. On the other hand, it would depend on whether Fang Xingjian was able to get a sufficiently influential character to testify for him. Sword arts had always been difficult to understand. Most ordinary people did not understand profound sword theories. When they were unable to rely on their own brains to make a judgment, the only thing they could do was to listen to the suggestions of experts. The stronger an expert was, the greater their reputation would be, and the more people would listen to their words. I'll send people to continue looking for those 3 students, but we'll have to make sufficient preparations as well. James thought of the scandal of a conferred knight from the Great Western region creating a sword technique, which resulted in his students suffering from internal injuries. Don't worry, I'll look for a few heavyweight old friends. Even if you go to the arbitration, you won't be at a disadvantage. Chapter 3:16. With regards to what James had said, it was impossible for Fang Xingjian to do nothing. Arriving at the entrance of the sacred land, Fang Xingjian looked at Zhou Xingwen, who was waiting there, and then walked up. In terms of connections, Fang Xingjian was a far cry from someone like James, who was the headmaster of the regional academy 2 generations ago. However, this did not mean that he had no connections at all. Handing the 3 letters to Zhou Xingwen, Fang Xingjian said calmly, "Help me send these 3 letters out. Remember, you must definitely send them to them." Zhou Xingwen looked at the letters. The first one was from the Northern Ice Region's Regional Academy's Relings. He asked, "You know this guy?" It said that his abilities have already surpassed that of the Northern Ice Region's governor. Fang Xingjian did not say anything. To be honest, if Rellings had not sent someone over to invite him to the Northern Ice region for an exchange a few days ago, he would not have gotten to know this person. Moreover, this letter was a desperate attempt. He was not sure if Rellings would be willing to testify for him regarding the rebirth sword technique during the arbitration. Zhou Xingwen looked at the second envelope. It was addressed to the current Regional Academy's headmaster, the Great Western Region's Governor Devitt. He knew that Devitt admired and supported Fang Xingjian a lot. However, he did not know that Fang Xingjian was actually trying to contact the second prince. Even if he had absolute confidence in the rebirth sword technique, it would be too foolish if he were to take it on by himself and wait for something to happen before asking for help from others. As the saying went, even a ferocious tiger would have to use its full power to capture a rabbit. Of course, Fang Xingwen had to make good use of his time and mobilize all the powers he could. It would be even better if the governor and the second prince could testify for him. When Zhou Xingwen saw the third letter, his eyes almost popped out as he said in astonishment, "You're going to send it to this lord? I'll give it a try." Fang Xingzhan's third letter was sent to the Holy Orison. This divine-level expert had once wanted to take Fang Xingzhan in as his disciple. If the Holy Orison really had an eye for talent, he might help Fang Xingzhan. Moreover, Fang Xingzhan had added a little sweetness to the contents of the letter. He didn't know if someone like Holy Orison would be satisfied, but it was meaningful to give it a try. After all, once a god-level figure like Holy Orison spoke, the arbitration would basically win. Who would dare to refute Holy Orison's theory? What if the Holy Orison proved that there was no problem with the rebirth sword technique? Who would dare to say that there was something wrong with this sword technique? After sending these 3 letters, Fang Xingzhan walked towards the sword gauntlet, intending to continue with today's research. Regardless of how the association's arbitration would turn out, he had done all the necessary preparations. At the end of the day, it was also that he wouldn't waste time and affect his own cultivation. If he were to continue to be unable to let it go, or even affect his cultivation and progress because of this matter, wouldn't he be putting the cart before the horse? When Fang Xingzhan arrived at the sword gauntlet, he noticed that the gazes of the people around him were all a little strange. They seemed to be filled with pity and disdain, and there were even people who were gloating. They then pointed at Fang Xingzhan and said something to the people next to them. Leon walked over with a gloomy countenance. When he saw Fang Xingzhan, he merely said coldly, "Xingzhan, come over here first. Teacher Hops is looking for you." This morning, the Sword Arts Department had received a notice from the Knight Association, raising the issue of the internal injuries caused by the rebirth sword technique and requesting for the department to conduct an internal investigation. Hops, who was the one who had approved the matter, had received a stern warning. As Hop's disciple, Leon was naturally embarrassed as well. And the reason for all this was because of Fang Xingzhan. Right now, Leon was obviously not in a good mood toward Fang Xingzhan. Arriving at the office, Hops lifted his head to look at Fang Xingzhan, smiled, and said, "You're here, Xingzhan." He handed the association's notice to Fang Xingzhan and asked, "What are your thoughts on this?" "It's just a waste of my time. There's definitely no problem with the rebirth sword technique." Leon said angrily, "If there's no problem with the rebirth sword technique, why did those 3 brats suffer from internal injuries? It's impossible for normal, nurturing sword techniques to suffer from sports injuries. Moreover, do you know, the latest news from the central government was obtained from a classmate of mine who went there. Someone from the central government has already found them. They're not suffering from ordinary internal injuries. All 3 of their internal organs have deteriorated and they're completely crippled. If they exert any strength, they'll bleed internally, and it's impossible for them to continue with their martial arts. If this continues on, their lives will be in danger." The 3 of them had cultivated the rebirth sword technique at the same time, and their internal organs had deteriorated at the same time. Furthermore, they had all been crippled, and the situation was even more serious than before. If it had only been the rebirth sword technique that had a problem, then with such an outcome, the arbitration would definitely receive more attention. "Oh, we couldn't find them when we looked for them, but the association just casually looked for them? That's even more of a problem for them." Fang Xingzhan did not give in at all. It should be said that from now on until the end of the arbitration, he would not give in at all. It was because once he showed the slightest sign of weakness, or even admitted that there might be some unknown problems with the rebirth sword technique, no one would forgive him. He would only end up in a situation of no return. Moreover, he had absolute confidence in the rebirth sword technique. To him, the other party's actions were just like that of a clown. Hop stopped Leon and said, "In terms of sword theories, there's no problem with the rebirth sword technique. This isn't my focus to begin with, But since the association is looking for trouble for no reason, I can't possibly watch as the people from our academy get bullied." Saying this, he let out a cold snort. Those people from the Night Association don't seek to improve themselves and are bureaucratic. To think that they've even set their sights on our great Western region. But now that the consequences are so serious and might even be life-threatening, you'll have to be even more careful during the arbitration. But don't worry, Xinjiang. I've already started cultivating the rebirth sword technique. If it's an arbitration, I'll be your witness. The reason why I've called you over today is so that you can focus on your cultivation and research. Don't be affected by the outside world. I know that there are some people in the academy who are jealous of those with talent. Don't take them to heart. Leon frowned and said, "Teacher, what if something happens to you after you cultivate the rebirth sword technique?" Hops glared at Leon and said, "How many times have I taught you? When cultivating sword arts and researching martial techniques, the most important thing is that you mustn't echo what others say. You must believe in your own cultivation, believe in your sword theories, and believe in your own judgment. You mustn't always follow behind others." He then waved his hand and said, "Xinjiang, you can go. Focus on your cultivation and don't get distracted." "Teacher Hops, thank you." Fang Xinjiang then suddenly asked, "Teacher, do you know of a martial technique that can allow one to create clones of Earth?" "Oh, why did you suddenly think of asking this?" Hops gave it some thought and said, "The 90,000 godly demon flash that you've learned is already a top-notch killing technique for clones. As for the other clones, most of them were forcefully formed by manipulating matter. It's not an ordinary form. It's one that can move independently or from a distance. It can even speak." Hop's brows twitched as he said, "This type of martial technique is very rare. I heard that the Sand Country specializes in controlling soil. The southeastern region, which has been at war with them for a long period of time, is also quite proficient in this." "Thank you, teacher. I'll be leaving first." As expected, it's the Sand Country. Fang Xinjiang stared at everyone's various gazes as he arrived at the research room of the Dragon Scale. Before he even got close, he could already hear snoring sounds. After Fang Xinjiang left, Hops suddenly let out a sigh. Leon asked, "Master, what's wrong?" Hops said, "You're still unconvinced? That's because you've only seen the surface of this matter." Surface? Chapter 3:17. Is there really a need to prove whether the rebirth sword technique is harmful or not? Hops shook his head. This is just an excuse. Since someone has pushed for the first step, there will naturally be someone who will push for the subsequent events. Do you know? This is the first time I've seen the rebirth sword technique. What I saw was not only excitement, but also fear. If the rebirth sword technique is real, then, with a 10 times increase in potential, how much would all the knights, conferred knights, and knight apprentices receive? If it's real, then what about the nurturing sword techniques of the other factions? What would the factions do? Give up on their nurturing sword techniques? Then would they still have apprentices? Not give up. Then would their apprentices be surpassed by the empire? And what would the government think when faced with the people of the middle and lower levels, as well as the knights and knight apprentices who are about to receive a great leap in their abilities? Do they really hope for the factions to grasp this sword technique as well? Had the Church of Universal Truth also grasped this sword technique? Do they really hope for their subordinates to improve by leaps and bounds, for the apprentices who are not part of the system to improve as well? By the time Hops said this, Leon's back was already drenched in sweat. "You're saying that this time around, we're going up against..." Hops merely stood up and looked at the people outside, saying, 500 years ago, in order to forbid commoners from cultivating martial arts, the Uzbekistan Empire even spread the theory that cultivating martial arts would lead to premature aging. 200 years ago, in order to develop tobacco, the Northern Trade Association spread the fallacy that tobacco could increase one's attributes. The right to speak in this world has always been controlled by the strong, unless there's an even stronger person who can break their restrictions. But since that's the case, why would the association publish the rebirth sword technique in the Knight's Handbook? Hops laughed out loud. It's because they don't believe it. They know how amazing the rebirth sword technique is, but they don't believe that it has 10 times the efficiency and 5,000 potential points. Who would believe that? And the fact that it has reached such a level means that there's already someone in the Central who has mastered the rebirth sword technique. But teacher, why are you doing this? If His Majesty and the other faction sect leaders aren't prepared to accept the rebirth sword technique, then they should accept it, Hops said calmly. Hops said calmly, I only hope that the Empire's new generation can cultivate the most outstanding sword techniques. I hope that all the powerful martial skills can be popularized and not be in the hands of a small group of people. I wish that when I started practicing sword arts at the age of 5, I would have been able to practice such a sword art. Does Xinjiang know? He doesn't need to know. On the other side, Fang Xinjiang opened the door to the research lab and walked in. He saw that most of Sasa's subordinates had already fallen asleep. They were too tired and only slept for 1 or 2 hours every day. Working around the clock to help Sasa analyze the ancient characters had overloaded their brains, and their energy had been depleted. Sasa saw Fang Xinjiang coming in and forced a smile. You're here? Then we're leaving. You can continue. When Sasa passed by Fang Xinjiang, he heard Fang Xinjiang say softly, If I tell you the secret of the dragon scale, will you stop? Sasa's footsteps paused, and at the next moment, he asked puzzledly, What secret? What do you mean by stopping? Fang Xinjiang smiled and said, It's nothing. Speaking of which, my research has also reached a bottleneck. I reckon that in the end, you'll still be the one to successfully analyze the dragon scale. Sasa led his subordinates out of the research lab. As he walked along the corridor, his gaze suddenly narrowed. This guy is already suspecting me? But it's useless now. I've only pushed forward the first step. Even if I want to stop now, I can't. The problem with the rebirth sword technique? His greatest problem is that he's too outstanding. Things that are 10 years ahead will be sought after, but things that are 100 years ahead will only be suppressed by the current influences. They won't allow this power to be grasped by apprentices and factions. As for factions, if apprentices are the foundation, then the rebirth sword technique is digging up their roots. In the research lab, Fang Xinjiang watched as Sasa left slowly and thought coldly to himself. Could it be him? Fang Xinjiang had thought that the person who had threatened him was someone from the Sand Country, and that their target was the heavenly abyss annihilation armor he was wearing. However, when he saw Sasa, he suddenly recalled that Sasa had been staying at the borders of the Sand Country all year round, fighting against the Sand Country's experts. Although it was impossible for Fang Xinjiang to see through a person's heart, a level 21 conferred knight would be able to see a person's brain waves and emotions. If one did not know the inside story, they would definitely not understand what Fang Xinjiang meant when he said that he wanted to keep the secret and stop. Fang Xinjiang had not even told the governor and Hops about the matter of threatening to go to the Sand Country. He had only told them about his internal injuries. When Fang Xinjiang said this, he had clearly seen ecstasy, greed, and nervousness from Sasa. Although these emotions had disappeared completely in the blink of an eye, and Sasa had also replied that he did not know, Fang Xinjiang suddenly realized that Sasa was also very suspicious of him being the mastermind behind this. To think that he would go to such an extent for the sake of an ancient era's sword technique. But he's disguised himself as someone from the Sand Country. Even if I suspect that it's him, there's no way for me to prove it. Moreover, I'm only suspecting it. It might not be him. Fang Xinjiang could tell that even with Sasa's status as a level 29 expert, he would definitely have to pay a great price to push and accelerate these things. Moreover, by doing this, he would at most be able to stop Fang Xinjiang, but it would not be of any help to his own research. Interesting. Could it be that the Heaven's Volition sword intent still has some secrets that I don't know about? After all, Fang Xinjiang was not a native of the Empire. He had not expected how great of an impact the rebirth sword intent would have on the entire Empire. He put out his hand to touch the dragon scale, and he could sense a sharp aura gushing toward him. Sword intent was formless and intangible, and when it entered one's body, it was an indescribable feeling. It could only be said that the waves of piercing pain and slicing sensation allowed Fang Xingjian to ascertain that there was indeed something that had come into contact with his body. Even the level 29 superior divine weapon, the Heavenly Abyss Annihilation Armor, was unable to fend it off. Fang Xingjian could sense that there seemed to be something flowing in his consciousness. Do you want these sword techniques? If you do, then come and get them. As long as you lend me your powers, you can have any sword techniques you want. Fang Xingjian then continued to send out the information about the rebirth sword intent bit by bit, continuing to tempt the Heaven's Volition sword intent in the dragon scale. A few hours passed by, and the sword intent grew increasingly restless. It was like a snake coiling around Fang Xingjian's body. However, it was guarding its bottom line, refusing to enter Fang Xingjian's body completely. Finally, Fang Xingjian's countenance turned grim, and he sent out all the information about the rebirth sword intent. He then sent out another stream of ether sword ripples, slashing onto the dragon scale. My talent in sword arts is the best in the world. If you want sword arts, I'm the best choice. Sensing the endless greed, hunger, and other desires coming from the dragon scale, Fang Xingjian laughed out loud and said, "Come on. As long as you lend me your powers, I can lend you any sword techniques you want. As long as I'm still alive, I'll definitely become the world's strongest swordsman and create the world's strongest sword technique. If you want it, then come over." Chapter 3:18. At the next moment, the entire dragon scale started to tremble intensely, as if it was excited and agitated by Fang Xingjian's words. The atmosphere let out ear-piercing cries, and Fang Xingjian could sense that there seemed to be something boiling in the space. Even the density of the ether particles in the surroundings had gradually increased. At the next moment, he felt an extremely sharp aura gushing into his brain, as if wanting to drill into his consciousness. This time around, it was not a simple information flow like the previous time. Instead, the entire sword intent had darted in. Fang Xingjian felt as if his brain was going to be sliced into pieces and then explode. In that instant, it was as if 10,000 years had passed. Fang Xingjian felt as if his eyes had seen an endless amount of information. However, this information had only stopped at the surface layer of his consciousness for less than 0.1 seconds before drilling into the depths of Fang Xingjian's consciousness together with the Heaven's Volition sword intent. Sensing that his consciousness had slowly turned from boiling water to a calm lake, Fang Xingjian let out a deep breath. Have I succeeded? He looked at his technique stats window and discovered that there was now an additional skill called the Heaven's Volition sword intent. He then released his Heaven's perception and sank into his consciousness, looking at his skill seeds. Therefore, he discovered that the skill seeds of the various sword techniques were emitting a faint glow, revolving around the waves and mental cultivation method as the center. Then, with the appearance of the Heaven's Volition sword intent, the skill seed that he had manifested flashed with a glow like that of the sun. It forcefully knocked away all the other skill seeds and dashed to the center, causing the prodigious astral divine powers waves and the universal sword dominance lunisolar to revolve around it. Beyond, there were the skill seeds of various sword techniques. Fang Xingjian looked at the Heaven's Volition sword intent's introduction. This skill did not have a level, and the introduction was very simple. Natural selection, survival of the fittest. Possesses the ability to evolve endlessly and improve endlessly. After using it, the user can borrow the power of the Heaven's Volition sword intent to engage in battle. Every second, 100,000 potential points are depleted. Looking at this introduction, Fang Xingjian even felt that this was not a real sword technique. It was purely borrowing the power of the Heaven's Volition sword intent to battle, and it even depleted 100,000 potential points every second. Moreover, Fang Xingjian could sense that the Heaven's Volition sword intent in his consciousness would be stirring at any moment. He could imagine that once his sword techniques stopped progressing and he did not learn any new sword techniques, this Heaven's Volition sword intent would probably leave him. Rather than saying that it was a technique, this Heaven's Volition sword intent felt more like a weapon, or rather, heretical god force. Fang Xingjian's eyes narrowed. Sacrificing things in exchange for external power. Isn't it similar to the diabolic force of the Mageweth? How powerful would it be if it consumed 100,000 potential points every second? But from the looks of it, it seems to strengthen my strength and not a specific attack. However, right now, Fang Xingjian did not have 100,000 potential points that he could consume. He could only save up 30,000 potential points a day, and he would need 4 days to accumulate 100,000 potential points. After temporarily understanding the concept of the Heaven's Volition Sword intent, Fang Xingjian lifted his head and looked at the dragon scale. The dragon scale, which had lost the Heaven's Volition Sword intent, was no longer emitting a crimson-red glow. It did not even have the characteristic of fluctuating between hot and cold anymore. Fang Xingjian looked at the dragon scale and suddenly smiled. He then looked at his stats window. His ether synchronization rate had already reached 28%. Although he had to divert his attention to analyze the dragon scale during this period of time, the long period of time spent analyzing the waves of ether particles had not caused the rate at which his ether synchronization rate was increasing. He once again recalled what that female teacher had said previously. When a conferred knight's ether synchronization rate reached 30%, they would be able to see all sorts of light and sound waves. At the same time, they would be able to channel information currents into other physical substances, just like how the melancholic monarch had created the Pantheon Monument or the Heavenly Abyss Annihilation Armors will impact. Since you're being heartless, then don't blame me for being unjust. Since he was certain that Sasa was the one who had reported the matter of the hidden injuries to the association, Fang Xingjian was not someone to be trifled with. Therefore, he would not let Sasa off so easily. Then you can go back first. You can come back after my synchronization rate reaches 30%. Under Fang Xingjian's urging, the Heaven's Volition Sword intent reluctantly returned to the dragon scale. Therefore, the dragon scale once again turned crimson red, once again emitting auras that alternated between hot and cold. The Heaven's Volition Sword intent was a type of wave that had information or will channeled into it. Its power lay in the fact that the person who channeled it could rely on their will or information to interfere with the physical world. Therefore, the Heaven's Volition Sword intent, which had been channeled with the same information, could also interfere with the physical world directly, causing Fang Xingjian to be able to borrow its power. The reason why Fang Xingjian wanted to let the Heaven's Volition Sword intent return to the dragon scale was because he wanted to wait until his synchronization rate reached 30% before he absorbed the Heaven's Volition Sword intent. He would then disguise his information currents as sword intent and send them into the dragon scale, allowing Sasa to absorb them. Fang Xingjian's synchronization rate had already reached 28%. He was confident that with his lead, he would definitely be able to reach 30% before Sasa finished analyzing the dragon scale and absorbed the Heaven's Volition Sword intent. Therefore, over the next few days, Fang Xingjian gave up on analyzing the dragon scale and focused on his own cultivation. He spent almost all of his time in the sacred land, where the density was 100 times higher. To others, it was as if he had given up. In a dragon scale research lab, several tens of experts were gathered. Under Sasa's unified command, some of them were looking up information, some were discussing words, some were making inferences about historical data, and some were sorting out their translation conclusions. Sasa's level 29 conferred night cultivation provided him with powerful brain power. Right now, he was like a super calculator, able to handle all the information and resources, allowing everyone's abilities to be unleashed to the greatest extent and greatly increasing their progress. It's going to be quick, and at most one more day, the translation of the words on the dragon scale will be completed. Then, we'll be able to really analyze the waves. As long as we analyze the waves on the dragon scale and send our consciousness into it, we'll be able to start absorbing the sword intent. After all, Sasa was a level 29 expert. His cultivation, experience, and intelligence were all not to be underestimated. Although it was not as convenient as Fang Xingjian's, he had more or less figured out the existence of the dragon scale and knew what he had to do from now on. Just then, someone walked over and asked, "Sir, it's time for our research." However, Fang Xingjian still hasn't come today. Should we continue? Hearing this news, Sasa could not help but smile. He's probably too busy right now. There's no need to bother about him. Let's continue. It was said that the arbitrators sent by the Empire had already entered the Great Western region and were about to arrive at the Regional Academy. Sasa felt that the fact that Fang Xingjian was not continuing with the research on the dragon scale meant that his rhythm had been completely disrupted by the arbitrators and he was about to give up. However, just as he was thinking this, the door opened and Fang Xingjian walked in slowly. Chapter 319. Just 1 hour ago, in the sacred land with 100 times, James hurried over to Fang Xingjian's training room, feeling a little worried. The arbitration team sent by the association will be arriving in 1 or 2 days. Xingjian hasn't been to the sword tower for a few days. Is he really too young and unable to keep his composure? Thinking of this, he knocked on the door and shouted, "Xingjian, are you there?" The training rooms in the sacred land all had defense mechanisms. Even James would not be willing to barge in recklessly. Not long later, the door opened. Fang Xingjian threw a glance at James, then turned and walked back to the training grounds, continuing to cultivate the aquatic sword formation. Streams of aquatic sword cheese could be seen gathering together, turning into a long river in midair. It flowed to and fro like a great river, releasing rumbling sounds. When James saw this scene, he was slightly stunned and said, "You still have the mood to cultivate the aquatic sword formation?" This was completely different from how he had imagined Fang Xingjian to be. Fang Xingjian said calmly, I wish to make good use of the time to cultivate it. It can be considered as a change of mind." A change of mind? After reading too many ancient era's words, it's good to have a change of mind. James nodded. There's still 1 or 2 more days before the arbitration team arrives. I've already contacted all the teachers in the sword arts department. They'll help you hold the fort. The few headmasters from the prefectural academy in the Great Western region will also be coming. It's a pity that the national selection next year is too important, and the old men from the other regions are making good use of the time to train their students. Otherwise, I'll definitely call them over. Fang Xingjian nodded. Until now, he had yet to receive a reply from the second prince, the Northern Ice region's Relings, or the Holy Orison. He sighed inwardly, thinking that he could only rely on himself. James continued, "The arbitration isn't complicated. They'll first investigate the condition of the 3 students' internal injuries, then question the witnesses we provided one by one, as well as your situation. Of course, in order to show fairness, the entire arbitration process will be made public. You must be prepared to face pressure." Fang Xingjian nodded. He felt that this association's arbitration was a little similar to the lawsuits on Earth. It was just that in the Empire, the testimonies of experts and the authority of various experts far surpassed the testimonies and evidence of ordinary people. This was especially so in an arbitration related to swordsmanship. Whichever side had a more authoritative witness would have a higher chance of winning. James comforted him. "Don't worry, I've asked around. This time, other than a few brats from the association and the people from that dojo, no one else will fight against us. Our chances of winning are very high. If it was just a simple proof of swordsmanship, James would have nothing to worry about. However, he understood that the matter before him was no longer a simple proof of swordsmanship. Recently, various warnings and reminders, be they overt or covert, had been presented to him one after another. Even with his experience, he still felt a great deal of pressure. But looking at Fang Xingjian, who was still growing, he felt a sense of comfort. Seems like I'll still have to hold on for a while longer, until Fang Xingjian and the other's generation have matured. Fang Xingjian continued to cultivate the aquatic sword formation. At the next moment, countless streams of aquatic sword cheese condensed into a huge wave, turning the entire room into a world of water. Fang Xingjian's aquatic sword formation had finally reached level 40. It was also at this moment that his eyes narrowed slightly. More information than before kept on gushing into his consciousness, and his heaven's perception received even more information. With the improvement in his sword arts, Fang Xingjian's ether synchronization rate also improved slightly, reaching 30%. At this moment, countless light waves and sound waves started to gush into his brain, and he started to see light and sound. This was a feeling that was many times more amazing than seeing light with one's eyes and hearing with one's ears. Sight was when one's eyes reflected light, and hearing was when one's ears felt vibrations in the air. It was because there was a limit to the frequency at which one could see light and the frequency at which one could feel the vibrations in the air. Right now, Fang Xingjian's ether synchronization rate had reached 30%. In that instant, he was able to see a reality that he had previously been unable to see. It was a world where he could see invisible light, infrasound, and ultrasound waves. The entire world seemed to have become extremely bizarre at this moment. However, it was also because he was able to see light and sound that even though Fang Xingjian's heaven's perception only had a range of 10 meters, he could still sense extremely far away places through the refraction of light and sound. At this stage, although he was blind, his vision and hearing far surpassed that of ordinary people. James looked at Fang Xingjian's dazed expression and asked, "What's wrong, Xingjian?" "Oh, right. Your ether synchronization rate is about to reach 30%, right? This heavenly barrier is very powerful and dangerous. It's because we humans are already used to seeing and hearing. It can be said that what we see and hear is what we think the real world is. However, when your ether synchronization rate reaches 30%, you'll be able to see a corner of the real world. To put it simply, everything won't be the same as before. The colors, shapes, trajectories, and other things will all change. Your sense of beauty, preferences, habits, and other senses will all go through a tremendous change. Moreover, once you step out, you won't be able to return. You'll have to experience all these for 24 hours. If your will is slightly weaker, you might go insane and become a lunatic. Remember, after your ether synchronization rate reaches 29%, you mustn't get close to the sacred land. I'll personally help you prepare to fast, bathe, burn incense, and stabilize your mind. You'll have to be careful even after you pass this stage. You'll have to slowly learn to filter out these information. Otherwise, if you're immersed in it, your mental state will get increasingly worse. Thinking of this, James let out a soft sigh. At his age, he had seen too many conferred knights who had reached this stage. Because they could not stand the way the real world was like, they would either go crazy or cripple their powers in order to return to their original world. Each step taken by a conferred knight was extremely arduous. It could be said that they were constantly moving from a human to an inhuman direction. As he spoke, James looked at Fang Xingjian, who was frowning slightly, and asked, "What's wrong? Are you not feeling well?" "Oh, it's nothing." Fang Xingjian shook his head slightly and got used to the discomfort brought about by the 30% increase. He said calmly, "My ether synchronization rate has reached 30%. Please arrange for some ferocious beasts for me to gain experience." "Oh, your ether synchronization rate has reached 30%? All right, I'll arrange for some ferocious beasts." Halfway through his words, James lifted his head abruptly and looked at Fang Xingjian as if he was looking at a ghost. "Your ether synchronization rate is 30%? How long has it been, and you've already leveled up? And didn't I tell you not to level up in the sacred land? What about the heavenly barrier? You weren't affected, were you? With an ether synchronization rate of 30%, you'll receive all sorts of light and sound waves in this stage. The entire world will be turned upside down in your eyes, and many conferred knights will even go crazy." Fang Xingjian turned his head. Right now, the world in his eyes was filled with densely packed light and sound waves. All the colors were no longer the same as before, and everyone looked distorted and deformed compared to before. All the voices also sounded out of tune. It felt as if the entire world style had changed. Without a strong spirit and will, one would probably really go crazy. It's because what you see and hear are different, and your sense of beauty is still the same as before. However, the people around you all look like alien monsters, and all the objects are disgusting, as if they came from hell. There are many colors and distortions that were not there before. However, given how intelligent Fang Xingjian was, the 10 heavenly stages posed no difficulty to him at all. He shook his head and said calmly, "I've already gotten used to it. There's no problem." Chapter 320. James looked at Fang Xingjian in a daze. But this. He let out a breath, sorted out his thoughts, and then said, "You're not affected by the 10 heavenly barriers? Didn't you feel any impact to your mind?" "Impact? Did I?" Fang Xingjian said calmly, "I just felt a little uncomfortable, but I'm basically fine now." "A little uncomfortable." James smiled bitterly. Back then, when his ether synchronization rate had reached 30%, his entire view of the world had almost collapsed. Everyone's appearances and voices had changed beyond recognition. When he saw that food had turned into something that looked like **T, and when he heard the sound of the wind, he felt like a ghost. It was really easy for him to go crazy. However, Fang Xingjian had managed to get past this stage while talking and laughing. It was really... James did not know how to describe it. In any case, even he felt a sense of jealousy. This kind of talent was really a little scary. Usually, only when a conferred knight's cultivation gradually increased and they were able to interfere and filter the information from light rays and sound waves would they be able to ignore a portion of the truth and see the truth in the eyes of ordinary people. However, Fang Xingjian did not care about this. "I'll have to trouble you with the arbitration. It's my turn to study the ancient era's relics today, right? My ether synchronization rate has increased. I'll go and try again." After returning to the sword tower an hour later, Sasa had just finished his words when he saw Fang Xingjian pushing open the door and walking in. "Oh, Xingjian, you're here?" Sasa smiled. "Haven't you been very busy recently? It's fine even if you don't come." Fang Xingjian threw a cold glance at Sasa and said, "Everyone go out. It's my time now." The corners of Sasa's lips twitched, and he let out a cold snort. In the end, he still brought everyone out. Fang Xingjian walked up to the dragon scale. "Come out." In that instant, there seemed to be something agitated in the air. Fang Xingjian once again experienced the intense pain of having 10,000 swords piercing through his heart. The Heaven's Volition sword intent was once again channeled into Fang Xingjian's mind. Looking at the deathly still dragon scale before him, Fang Xingjian smiled and touched it. In an instant, a stream of information flowed into the dragon scale. The so-called sword intent was also a type of information flow. The difference was that the sword intent mainly contained sword theories and emotions towards the sword Tao. The powerful aspect of the Heaven's Volition sword intent was that it could simply use information to interfere with the physical world. From Fang Xingjian's point of view, this could only be done by a high god realm master. Right now, he was writing out sets of sword theories and various feelings he had towards sword arts, turning them into information currents and channeling them into the dragon scale. Of course, it was impossible for him to use his real sword theory. What he used was a fake sword theory that he fabricated. He remembered that when he was young, he was especially fond of the contents of a wuxia book, and he recalled the understanding of the way of the sword in it. Sister Gui pursues Wu Wang pursues Tong Run pursues Dewei. Jia turned to Bing to Gung to Gui. Friends of Zi and Chou, friends of Chun and Si, friends of Wu and Wei. Wind and thunder changed, mountains and swamps changed, and so did water and fire. Qian and Kuan stimulated each other. Zhen and Dui stimulated each other, and Li and Sun stimulated each other. 3 increases to 5, 5 increases to 9. After doing all these, the dragon scale once again turned crimson red due to the channeling of information currents, exuding both scorching and cold auras. After doing all these, Fang Xingjian wanted to see how Sasa would court death. He was no longer willing to stay in the research room and continue putting on an act. Therefore, he returned to the sacred land to continue his cultivation. Elsewhere, a group of people from the center had also arrived at the great western city. The person in the lead was a beauty who appeared to be under 30 years of age. She had brilliant golden hair and a pair of sapphire eyes. The lady looked at the streets of the great western city and said coldly, "What era is it now? To think that there's still someone who dares to tamper with a self-created sword technique. To be able to cultivate nurturing sword techniques to the point of causing hidden injuries. What on earth are the association's upper echelon doing? How could they approve such a sword technique?" A subordinate smiled bitterly and said, "Sir, this Feng Xinjiang is someone favored by the governor and the second prince. When you arrive at the great western city, it's best for you to be careful with your words and actions." "Even I have to be careful? Then is this His Majesty's country or Devitt's governor's country?" The lady let out a cold snort and said, "The funds that the Empire allocates every year have been wasted by these vermin. To think that there's someone who tampers with nurturing sword techniques. This is a sword technique that even apprentices have to cultivate. By doing this, it's harming the people at the grassroots level and digging into the Empire's foundation. I definitely won't tolerate this. I'll give it my all in the arbitration this time around." Looking at this righteous-looking female officer, the other knights revealed a bitter smile. In the northern ice region, Rellings walked out from his room for training in seclusion. His face was filled with fury, and his eyes were filled with anxiety and bitterness. Why? How did things turn out like this? What on earth is wrong? Rellings cultivated saber arts. Although there were many similarities between saber arts and sword arts, if one were to make a serious comparison, there were still many differences. For example, saber arts focused on slashing, while sword arts focused on thrusting. This caused the way they battled to be very different, and there were also many differences in their daily cultivation. However, at Relling's level, both saber arts and sword arts were something he could pick up easily. Although his sword arts were not as powerful as his saber arts, they still far surpassed that of ordinary geniuses. However, this time around, when he was training in seclusion, he had wanted to change the rebirth sword technique into his own rebirth saber technique. However, he had encountered great difficulties. Moreover, seeing that he was unable to change such a powerful nurturing technique like the rebirth sword technique into his own saber arts, it was a great torment for him. He was like a kitten looking at dried fish but was unable to eat it. He was so anxious that he scratched his ears and cheeks. The moment he came out, he grabbed onto his younger brother and asked, "Where's Feng Xinjiang? Has he come? You guys invited him, right?" The man he had grabbed onto was a muscular man who bore a 70% to 80% resemblance to Rellings. Sensing that his body was being suppressed, he smiled bitterly and said, "We invited him, but he rejected. Damn it." However, his situation hasn't been too good recently. The central government has sent an arbitration team to the Great Western region. It seems that there's a problem with the rebirth sword technique. There's a problem with the rebirth sword technique? Rellings frowned and asked, "What problem?" The younger brother shrugged and said, "I heard that after a few apprentices cultivated the rebirth sword technique, they suffered from a certain degree of internal injuries. It seems that their internal organs have deteriorated." Ridiculous. Why would the trash from the central government believe in such a ridiculous theory? Feng Xinjiang even sent a letter. "It might be to ask for your help," the younger brother said carefully. His aptitude was not bad, but compared to his elder brother, Rellings, he was far too inferior. This caused him to be completely outshone by Rellings, and now he was almost like Rellings' follower. "Where's the letter?" Rellings tore open the letter roughly and started to scan through it. "Oh, so that's how it is? Is it a problem with the circulation of vital energy and blood? It's probably in conflict with my waves? But how could he possibly know? It seems that this guy also circulates his waves day and night. After reading it for a few minutes, Rellings would occasionally let out a joyful grunt. This continued until his eyes suddenly widened and he let out a cold snort. "What's going on?" "There's nothing else." He turned to look at his younger brother and asked, "Where's the letter? There aren't any other letters?" Seeing his younger brother shrugging, Rellings let out a sigh. "How unlucky. This guy is putting out bait for me." However, he still said to his younger brother, Pass me that piece of paper. Write me a letter to the Great Western Region Regional Academy." The younger brother's eyes opened wide, and he said, "Elder brother, you should know why things are like this, right? The situation here is too deep. The family hasn't even decided which side to stand on. What's that got to do with me? I don't know anything. What side? I don't know. I just feel that there's no problem with the rebirth sword technique. Just write it when I ask you to." The younger brother smiled bitterly and said, "Elder brother, you really just charge in wherever there's the most trouble. What's there to be afraid of? There's nothing major apart from becoming a god. Let the mortals worry about their own matters." Chapter 3:21. On the other side, on the Yalan's sacred mountain, on the snowy peak, a silhouette was dancing with a long sword on the snowy ground. Wherever the long sword passed by, the air would tremble and snowflakes would fly around. As different sword moves were performed, different trembling sounds would also ring out from within the body. It was as if there was thunder both inside and outside of the body. The cultivator's vital energy and blood were circulating in different ways according to the changes in the sword moves. Llewellyn walked over as well. Looking at the scene of sword cheese flying around, he stroked his beard and sighed. This rebirth sword technique really lives up to its name. Its sword moves not only train the muscles and organs, but also the bones. It can completely change one's physique and stimulate one's potential from the roots. Brother Huang Lin, your sword arts have improved tremendously again over the past month. The cultivator stopped his cultivation, and in that instant, a tremendous amount of heat was released from his entire body. It was as if he had turned into a huge furnace. This was because his entire body had been trained, and a tremendous amount of heat energy had to be released. A large portion of the surrounding snow melted in that instant. Huang Lin laughed and said, "This rebirth sword technique is too complicated. With my cultivation, even after cultivating day and night, I've only managed to reach the first level. It's hard to imagine how long it would take for ordinary people to cultivate. It's worth it even if you were to cultivate for a few years. The effects of the rebirth sword technique is something that no other nurturing sword technique can compare to," Llewellyn said, looking at Huang Lin. Huang Lin walked out from the snowy water, looked at Llewellyn energetically, and said, "Has the Guardian King made his decision? I can go to the great western city now, right?" "Haha, are you still in a hurry to testify for your disciple?" Llewellyn smiled. "Actually, even if you don't go, the more the truth is debated, the clearer it will be. They'll eventually prove that there's no problem with the rebirth sword technique. But the process of proving it probably won't be easy, right? The pressure from the various parties is too great. It's better for me to make a trip and cut the Gordian knot, saving them from wasting too much time and resources." Llewellyn sighed. Thinking of Feng Xingjian's face, he still felt an indescribable emotion. He stretched out his hand and handed a letter to Huang Lin. "This is a letter that Master took some time to write. He has already cultivated the rebirth sword technique to level 10 and is able to gain about 8,000 potential points every day. Of course, this is also related to Master's cultivation level. However, at the very least, it shows how powerful the rebirth sword technique is. Bring this letter to the great western city." A hint of surprise flashed in Huang Lin's eyes. Lord Guardian King is willing to testify for Xinjiang? It's not just testifying. A complicated look appeared in Llewellyn's eyes. Master submitted Feng Xinjiang's information to the north. He wants to invite him to join the martial techniques grading plan. The so-called martial techniques grading plan was a super plan prepared by the Holy See of Truth in recent years. The plan was to divide all the martial skills in the world into different categories and grades. For example, in nurturing sword techniques, the rebirth sword technique should be considered a high-level sword technique, while the grizzly bear sword technique and eagle sword technique should be considered low-level sword techniques. But how high was it? How low was it? There has never been a unified standard. The martial techniques grading plan was to test the effects and growth potential of all the martial techniques, and finally divide the effects and power of all the martial techniques. How many martial skills were there in the world? How many people in the entire miracle world were cultivating martial techniques? Once this plan was carried out, it would consume an enormous amount of resources. At the same time, if this plan succeeded, it would also change and benefit the entire world. Only the Holy See of Truth, which had once unified the entire North and was still the strongest organization on the mainland, could do such a thing. Hearing this, Huang Lin was also stunned for a moment. He asked, "The Guardian King wants Xinjiang to join this plan as well?" Yuelun smiled and said, "That's right. With a martial techniques grading plan, even if we are only in charge of a small portion of the sword techniques, the number of secret manuals and cultivation resources we will be able to see will be astronomical. This is a great thing." Yuelun's mind couldn't help but think of Fang Xinjiang's face. He sighed in his heart. "Master, why did you place him under the noble's eyes so early in the morning? What are you planning to do? Besides, is it really a good idea for us to get involved in this whirlpool of the empire?" In the commoner's district in the great western city, Sally, the arbitrator from the central government, walked slowly into a small alley. Before she got close, she was already covering her nose. A foul smell came gushing out. It was clear that the hygiene in the commoner's district was too bad, making Sally feel very uncomfortable. One of her subordinates walked up and asked, "Madam, we'll just go in. You could just wait outside. Don't say any more. I can hold on." Sally took in a few light breaths, took some time to get used to it, and then headed deeper into the commoner's district. But why are they still staying in a place like this? Didn't we say that we've already found them and even started to protect them? They aren't too cooperative and aren't too willing to follow us. Therefore, we got them to hide and then sent people to protect them. Along the way, all Sally saw were numb gazes, greedy gazes, and fearful emotions. It's too tough for the commoners of the empire's lower class. The entire country still has a long way to go. Sally then thought of Fang Xinjiang and clenched her fists. This be asterisk starred. For the sake of his own glory, he doesn't care about the situation of the commoners at all. The group of people walked up to a small house, knocked on the door, pushed it open, and entered. They saw a skinny young man lying on the bed. A little girl walked out and looked at them warily and fearfully. She asked, "Who are you guys?" Sally smiled, looked at the little girl, and said, "Hello, don't be afraid. We're arbitrators from the central government. We're here to look for Mike. Is Mike around?" The little girl subconsciously turned and looked at the young man on the bed. That skinny young man sat up. His eyes were sunken and bloodshot, and his face was pale. It was obvious that he was malnourished. He looked at Sally warily and asked, "You guys are arbitrators?" "Yes, arbitrators from the Night Association." Sally walked over and said in a gentle voice, "We're here because of the rebirth sword technique. Is it because you've cultivated the rebirth sword technique that your internal organs have deteriorated?" Mike was stunned for a moment. Then he lowered his head abruptly and mumbled, "What's the use of investigating? I'm already a cripple." "Of course it's useful," Sally said with a righteous expression. Sally said righteously, "If you don't step forward this time around, there'll be even more victims. If we're unable to prove that there's a mistake with the rebirth sword technique, it'll cause even more people to suffer from internal organs deteriorating like you. Therefore, we need your help." Seeing that Mike did not show any reaction, Sally slowly started to sense his body. As a level 25 conferred knight with an ether synchronization rate of over 60%, Sally was already able to sense the existence of cells and bacteria. She also had an accurate grasp of the human body. With this, her eyes opened slightly, and flames of fury burned at her heart. Chapter 322. Sally could sense that Mike's stomach was like the stomach of a dying old man. Not only was it completely curled up, but it was also like a decaying tree root, with most parts of it starting to rot and die. The stomach was extremely important, especially during the apprentice period. It was the most important place for the human body to absorb nutrients. Now that his stomach was severely failing, it was not just a problem of him not being able to cultivate. Mike might even die. How could Sally not be infuriated at the sight of this? Her eyes seemed as if they were going to spew out fire. What utter disregard for human life! How can a true nurturing sword technique cause one's internal organs to fester? To think that Fang Xingjian would even release such a sword technique for his own benefit. One of her subordinates coughed and said, "Madam, we're here to enforce the law impartially. It's best not to take a stand. Moreover, in terms of sword theory, the rebirth level doesn't have any major flaws." Sword theory? Flaws? Sally said furiously. "Look at these kids. This is the result of your sword theory. They're just mere humans. Just because they know some sword theory, they think that it's the truth of this world? Who do you think you are? All of you are like this. Just because you've grasped some extraordinary powers, you think of yourselves as gods. Are you going to ignore the facts that are right before your eyes? Even if it passes in terms of sword theory, as long as there's a 1 in 10,000 chance of harm, we have to stop it from being spread. Isn't this our duty? Is this the power that you believe in, the sword theory that caused such a tragedy?" One of her subordinates said, "Madam, we should at least wait for the arbitration to end before we can say the results. Is there still a need for an arbitration? If..." Under her subordinate's strong gazes, Sally did not continue speaking. Instead, she looked at Mike with a pained expression and asked, "Mike, tell us everything you know. When did you start feeling stomach pain? What did you cultivate? What did you eat? And how was your daily routine?" In the following day, Sally visited a total of 3 apprentices who had met with mishap, as well as the teachers, other apprentices, and staff of the dojo. The results were very shocking to her. For what she asked, everything seemed normal, except for the fact that Mike and the others had cultivated the rebirth sword technique. From this point, it seemed that the cause of the entire incident was also the rebirth sword technique. This kind of swordsmanship can actually pass the association's examination. Sally gritted her teeth and said, "Inform the people from the Great Western Region Regional Academy that the arbitration will begin 3 days later. Get them to make their preparations. I want to see how they're going to explain themselves. After this arbitration, I'll apply to stop all exchanges and learning activities related to the rebirth sword technique as soon as possible and put them on the list of prohibited items. That's right. Take them away and protect them. We can't let them get hurt again. The mistakes of adults shouldn't be borne by these children." In the office of Head of Department James in the Great Western Region Regional Academy, 7 to 8 senior teachers from the Sword Arts Department were gathered. Other than Hops, who was focused on his research and was unable to come, these were the few most amazing people in the Sword Arts Department. At this time, Fang Xingjian was standing behind James, quietly enduring the crowd's gaze. James said, "The arbitration team sent by the central government has already arrived at the Great Western City. They just want to take a look at the 3 injured students. All of their internal organs have suffered from severe deterioration, and their lives are in danger. The arbitration will probably be held in a few days' time." A conferred knight with a big beard said impatiently, "What else is there to say about this? Those who truly understand sword arts and have sufficient sword arts cultivation wouldn't think that there's a problem with the rebirth sword technique. This sword technique was refined from the essence of several nurturing sword techniques. If there's a problem with it, wouldn't that mean that there's a problem with the other nurturing sword techniques as well?" A female conferred knight said, "Things aren't that simple. The rebirth sword technique will affect everyone in the entire empire. It's possible that the higher-ups haven't thought of how to handle such a bomb." Hearing that, Fang Xingjian blinked. It was as if he had just realized that the rebirth sword technique might not be something that many people in the empire would be happy to see. James interrupted them and said, "All right, stop arguing. In any case, the people from the association have come looking for us. But no matter what, Xingjian is one of us. We can't let the people from the central government do as they please. Therefore, this time around, we must stand united against the outsiders. The reason why I've asked you guys to come over is to unify our thoughts. Don't drag me down during the arbitration. Don't worry, Head of Department. How can we drag you down? This time around, the association is just messing around. 3 people are injured, and they want to blame it on the sword technique? I think there's someone behind this. A bunch of people who don't know anything about sword arts would think that this is a problem with the rebirth sword technique. A sword technique like this should be popularized. I also hope that my son and grandson will be able to cultivate a sword technique like the rebirth sword technique in the future. James nodded in satisfaction. All right, you guys can go now. Perform well during the arbitration, but don't go overboard. Just tell the truth. Watching as everyone slowly left, James nodded and said, when the time comes, Governor Devitt, the few deputy governors, and the regional chief will all be here as witnesses. Don't worry. You're now a member of our regional academy. We won't let you suffer any losses. Fong Xingjian nodded. Thank you, head of department. There's no need to thank me. Just work hard and don't waste your talent. That'll be my greatest consolation. James suddenly asked, oh, right. I heard that you haven't been to the sword tower for the past few days. Have you been affected? Don't let it affect you. Just do what you should be doing. I know. I'm not affected. It's good that you're not affected. You should cultivate and decipher the ancient texts. With me around, even if the association's chief comes, he won't be able to do anything to you. James' countenance sank slightly. They had sent people to search for the three brats for so long, but they had not been able to find them. Now that the people from the arbitration team had seen them the moment they arrived, how could he possibly believe that there was nothing fishy going on? Head of department, the pressure this time around is very great, right? Fong Xingjian suddenly looked at James and asked, the arbitration this time around is no longer as simple as proving whether or not the rebirth sword technique is harmful, right? James looked at him and smiled, saying, hee, it's nothing. This is our matter. You just focus on your research. Oh, right. When are you going to give me the remaining 4 levels of mysteries of the Pantheon Monument? Fong Xingjian continued to stare at him. Their gazes met, as if neither of them was willing to give in. However, James was still the one who shook his head and said, it's useless even if you know about it. It'll only add to your worries and affect your cultivation. Why do you have to do this? The pressure was too great. Thinking of the people who had been coming to visit him, asking him questions, and pleading for him, James really did not wish for such pressure to be passed on to Fong Xingjian. It would affect his cultivation and research too much. Fong Xingjian continued, anyway, you won't be able to hide it anymore. Are you still not planning to say it? James' lips twitched. It's just that some old fools are unwilling to give up on the small benefits before them and want to hinder the world's development. They should be the ones who are under more pressure. Hinder the world's development. Fong Xingjian lowered his head and started to think. Wasn't the second prince's faction the reformist faction? Then the rebirth sword technique would be able to increase the power of the commoners and weaken the influence of the royal family and factions. This would mean that the solidified social classes would be weakened to a certain extent, increasing the mobility of the people and opening up a path for the reformist faction. What role did the second prince play in this entire matter? Fong Xingjian thought, is that why the Academy is so supportive of me reporting the rebirth sword technique? They've long seen the possibility of this sword technique being able to help them reform this empire and speed up the process of breaking the rigid rule of the current social classes. Fong Xingjian could not help but admit that compared to these people's political sensitivity, his thinking in this area was still too immature. While he was still focusing on his sword arts, the second prince had already started to use the rebirth sword technique to set up his plans for the world and had started to fight openly and covertly against the resistance forces. However, Fong Xingjian did not mind. He only liked sword arts to begin with, and he only wanted to use sword arts to solve problems. This was his style. After leaving James' office, he headed for the sacred land. On the way, he saw Rhoda walking over, and there were 2 black-clothed men whom Fong Xingjian had never seen before. Chapter 3:23. Looking at Fong Xingjian, Rhoda forced a smile. How have you been? Fong Xingjian looked at the 2 people behind Rhoda and asked calmly, what happened? Nothing much. Rhoda fell silent for a moment before suddenly asking, Xingjian, what do you think of the rebirth sword technique? It's a good sword technique. Just as Fong Xingjian said this, the man in black behind Rhoda walked out and said, all right, Rhoda, stop dragging things out. Let me get straight to the point. This man in black had white hair and a ruddy complexion, but his gaze was cold and sinister. His lips were very thin and pale. and he appeared to be a vicious and merciless person. The corners of the old man's lips curled down as he looked at Fang Xingjian and said, Fang Xingjian, the rebirth sword technique has great implications. Before you've completely researched the sword technique, you shouldn't spread it out. You're too careless in this aspect. You should cultivate for a few more years before creating your own sword technique. Fang Xingjian threw a glance at Rhoda and asked, Who is this old man? The old man in black's eyes widened, and he said furiously, It's really as the rumors say. What an arrogant lad. Rhoda frowned and said helplessly, Xingjian, this is our clan's old ancestor. He left to cultivate 50 years ago and has never cared about us. Yet now, he wants us to pass a message to you. The old ancestor is already at second transition, level 22. To the small aristocrats in the city where Rhoda was from, a level 22 conferred knight was already an important character who was like a god. However, there was not much respect in Rhoda's eyes. After all, this was the regional academy, and she had personally witnessed Fang Xingjian defeating conferred knights many times. Since you've already left home, why did you come back? You weren't around when others needed you, but when they didn't, you popped out. How could a level 22 conferred knight be of any importance to Fang Xingjian? He threw a casual glance at the old man in black and said, Scram, don't interfere with Rhoda. Her talent is much higher than yours. Don't hold her back. Me? I'm delaying him. The black-robed old man was so infuriated that his lungs were about to explode. 50 years ago, he had left home and joined the Li River sect. He had trained hard in the sect and had finally reached second transition level 22. Which of the juniors would not tremble in fear when they saw him? This time, he was ordered by the sect master to talk to Fang Xingjian. Who would have thought that this Fang Xingjian would actually give him no face at all? Fine. You think I won't dare to do anything to you just because you have James and Holden behind you? I'll make a move now. I want to see what they can do to me without you by my side. As he spoke, the black-robed elder stretched out his hand, and a stream of blood shot out from his palm. In the blink of an eye, it transformed into a blood spear which stabbed towards Fang Xingjian. This myriad blood spear contained countless types of curses and poisons. With just a slight touch, it would seep into one's body through one's skin. By then, all sorts of extreme itchiness and pain would be felt, making it difficult for one to choose between life and death. The black-robed elder's arm trembled, and the blood spear turned into a wave of blood that gushed out towards Fang Xingjian, wanting to engulf his entire body and make him suffer. This wave of blood gushed up into the sky, as if a tsunami had appeared out of nowhere. That pungent smell of blood could almost cause ordinary people to faint from fright. If this wave of blood gushed out, it would probably be able to engulf an entire village. The moment the old man made his move, he displayed the tyrannical power of a level 22 conferred knight. Moreover, he did not hold back at all. He wanted to teach Fang Xingjian a good lesson. This damn lad. After being praised by a few old fools in the Great Western region, he no longer knows how high the heavens are and how deep the earth is. Just as the old man was thinking of this, Fang Xingjian tapped out with a finger, and over 1,000 streams of aquatic sword cheese gushed out, also turning into a tsunami and gushing out. However, compared to the old man's blood wave, the tsunami of over 1,000 streams of aquatic sword cheese was almost deafening, and its aura was many times more majestic. The tsunami formed from over 1,000 streams of aquatic sword cheese, turned into a huge palm, and smashed out fiercely. Just the shock waves formed from the tremors in the air caused the old man's blood wave to dissipate with a loud boom. They were both level 22 conferred knights, but Fang Xingjian's aquatic sword formation was at level 40, while the old man's myriad blood spear was only at level 15. How could they be a match for each other? The old man bellowed furiously, and streams of blood waves smashed toward the huge palm formed from the tsunami. The blood waves, which had a pressure of several hundred kilograms per square meter, could smash anyone into the ground like the scene of a car accident. However, they were unable to do anything to Fang Xingjian's aquatic sword cheese. The streams of blood waves were torn apart and crushed. In the end, the old man in black was sent flying by the huge palm. He spurted out a large mouthful of blood in midair, and it was unknown how many bones he had broken. Damn it! To think that this Fang Xingjian is so powerful? Could it be that he relied on his own abilities to clear the entire Killing Techniques Palace? He's only 17 years old. How is this possible? Even when he had fallen to the ground, his eyes continued to stare at Fang Xingjian, as if he could not understand how Fang Xingjian could be so much stronger than him. You're only at level 22, struggling at death's door. You're not even as powerful as I was when I was at level 20. Fang Xingjian shook his head and said, Rhoda, only the regional academies, second transition, and killing techniques are the way to the throne. Don't follow his example and take the unorthodox path, learning the martial arts of some small sections. You'll only end up harming yourself and others. For the old man to be able to go through the second transition and reach level 22, although he had expended a lot of hard work and had reached the limits of his talent, even using various secret techniques from the Li River sect, this had always been the thing that he was most proud of. How could he tolerate such criticism from Fang Xingjian? This was especially so when it came to the word small sects. It hit him where it hurt the most. When the old man heard this, he was so infuriated that he spurted out a large mouthful of blood and almost fainted. Looking at the old ancestor who was lying on the ground like a drowned rat, Rhoda looked at Fang Xingjian in astonishment. The last time she had seen him clearing the Killing Techniques Palace, Fang Xingjian had not been so powerful. To think that he could now defeat a level 22 conferred knight with a single move. She had seen Fang Xingjian's performance in the Killing Techniques Palace previously and knew that her old ancestor was probably not a match for Fang Xingjian. That was why she had brought him here, wanting to borrow Fang Xingjian's power to shake off the old ancestor's suppression. However, she had not expected that the old ancestor would not even be able to take a single move from him. Hearing Fang Xingjian's words, Rhoda's gaze narrowed. When she lifted her head again, she saw that Fang Xingjian had already left. She shouted loudly, Fang Xingjian, I'll definitely not learn from him. I'll definitely complete the second transition in a dignified manner, break through the Killing Techniques Palace, and then walk right up to you. However, Fang Xingjian did not listen to her. The black-robed old man's arrival was a signal. If it could be said that the association had informed the Sword Arts Department to investigate themselves earlier so that they could comprehend it themselves and surrender, then the old man's arrival meant that the other party had seen that they were planning to fight to the end and was starting to exert real pressure on them. Otherwise, how could a second transition level 22 conferred knight possibly be so arrogant and enter so casually? Are they going to start with the people around me? Fang Xingjian seemed to be able to sense waves of invisible power pressing down on the Great Western region and the Great Western City. After returning to the training room, Fang Xingjian temporarily put aside his worries. It was useless for him to let his thoughts run wild. The most important thing now was to raise his abilities. Moreover, the Second Prince's faction would definitely go and fend off the real pressure. Therefore, he started to control the skill seeds in his consciousness to synthesize them. His aquatic sword formation was already at the maximum level of 40, and it was time for him to synthesize it with the Thunder Prison Earth Sword. Once he succeeded, he would have completed the third level of the Killing Techniques Palace's sword techniques, and he would be even closer to the final prodigious demolition sword. Chapter 3:24. After finding the seed that was flashing with azure blue light, Fang Xingjian pressed this skill seed toward the thunder-immuring earth sword. In that instant, he could sense countless streams of information flowing back and forth. Just as the skill synthesis was about to succeed, there was an explosive bang, and the aquatic sword formation skill seed shattered completely. All the relevant information disappeared. Fang Xingjian sighed. If he were to fail, he would have no choice but to start cultivating again. Thankfully, he had already made sufficient preparations beforehand. Looking at the stone wall on the side, he saw that it was already filled with the contents of the aquatic sword formation. It even included his previous cultivation insights and experiences. Half an hour later, a stream of aquatic sword chi rose up from Feng Xingjian's palm. He started to cultivate the aquatic sword formation once again. He continued cultivating until that night. Feng Xingjian looked at the sky and narrowed his eyes. It should be about time. They had tried to look for the 3 students who had suffered from internal injuries during their cultivation, but they had not been able to find them. Therefore, they could only continue to strengthen the evidence of the rebirth sword technique. However, with the arrival of the arbitrators, the 3 students appeared one after another. Even their teacher, who had not been able to find them, had appeared in the great western city. Moreover, the situation was getting increasingly tense. The 3 letters he had sent out had yet to receive any reply. Therefore, he had to make early preparations. One of the methods was to find the 3 students and investigate the reason for their injuries. He had wanted to investigate the reason for their injuries a long time ago. However, they had been in hiding, and they had not been able to find them. Right now, they were together with the arbitrators and were no longer in hiding. Moreover, the matter of the rebirth sword technique was not simply about the sword technique's strengths and weaknesses. It also involved the fights between the Empire's upper echelons. Although he did not like such fights, he did not wish to be passive. Instead, he preferred to take the initiative to attack. Therefore, the detailed information was also what Feng Xingjian wanted to know. Moreover, he had absolute confidence in his own abilities. James had judged that with his sword arts and the existence of the Heavenly Abyss Annihilation Armor, there were very few conferred knights who would be able to win against him unless they were at least level 25 or 26. Therefore, he took advantage of the darkness and left the academy, arriving at the great western city like a gust of night wind. At the same time, in the training room where Holt was, he was reading a letter. It was a letter from his master, a level 29 grade expert, the disciple of a divine level expert, and an expert of similar status as the Holy Orzin's disciple Yuan Lawrence. Is that what master and the others mean? Holt frowned. I've always felt that the rebirth sword technique is no longer just an academic debate. As expected, it has already implicated the interests of many top-notch influences. But is it really good to suppress it like this? Holt sighed and looked at the letter in his hand silently. But no matter what, he had to follow the contents of the letter. Once I present Master's letter during the arbitration and prove the flaws of the rebirth sword technique, Feng Xingjian's reputation would be ruined, right? Although Holt had always wanted to surpass Feng Xingjian, he had never thought that it would be through such a method. He shook his head and thought of how a genius who had created a revolutionary sword technique would end up being suppressed by everyone else because the sword technique he had created was too outstanding. Holt instantly felt a sense of sympathy for the death of a rabbit. It's a pity, Feng Xingjian. You were born in the wrong era. It seems that I won't have a chance to win against you anymore. It was because Holt knew that no matter how hard he worked, it would be impossible for him to win against a dead person. Elsewhere, Feng Xingjian was roaming around the great western city. Right now, not only had Feng Xingjian reached the pinnacle in his sword arts, but his attributes had also been continuously increasing due to the tremendous amount of resources he received every day. His attributes had become: name Feng Xingjian, age 17, occupation Heavenly Sword Sovereign level, 22 strength, 115 plus 8 agility, 216 plus 8 reaction, 112 endurance, 88 flexibility, 88 ether synchronization rate, 31%. The attributes above come into effect once the prodigious astral divine powers waves is activated. Due to perfect muscles, plus 8 in strength and agility, 10% of the strength and agility attribute. Techniques: boundaries negation, level 40 rebirth sword technique, level 40 new 9-headed dragon sword technique, level 40 zenith light sword formation, level 40 ether sword ripples, level 4 ether divine art, level 40 thunder prison earth sword, level 12 aquatic sword formation, level 1 lightless sword, heaven's volition sword intense specialties, genius swordsmanship, elementary survival instinct. internal healing, internal training, sword specialist, heightened reflexes, perfect muscles, single sword world subjugation, elementary berserkness, unparalleled sword intent, apex, sword bones, swordless path, darkness sword sense, heavenly sword imprint waves level 2 prodigious astral divine powers waves mental cultivation method level 5 universal sword dominance lunisolar regardless of whether it was his attributes, techniques, or specialties, other than his ether synchronization rate. His abilities were comparable to that of a level 25 conferred knight. This was especially so when he had the Zenith Light Sword formation for long-range attacks, the Ether Sword Ripples for close combat, the Thunder Prisoner Sword for support, the explosive speed of Boundaries Negation, and the explosive strength of Terra Ingurgitation. His instantaneous explosive output was something that even a level 25 conferred knight could not compare to. Moreover, he still had the Heavenly Abyss Annihilation Armor's ultimate defense, as well as the Heaven's Volition Sword intent that was hidden in the center of his consciousness. In order to use the Heaven's Volition Sword intent and Boundaries Negation, which required potential points, Fang Xingjian had saved up a total of 120,000 potential points. Of course, this was only enough for the Heaven's Volition Sword intent to use for 1 second. The Heaven's Volition Sword intent required 100,000 potential points per second was simply too much. I wonder if there will be any whetstones that will allow me to use the Heaven's Volition Sword Chi today. It was as if a black line had swept across the night sky, and Fang Xingjian arrived at a small alley. Ferdinand was already waiting there. Ferdinand passed a piece of paper to Fang Xingjian and said, "They're all here now, being taken care of by the arbitration team. This time around, the arbitration team has sent a total of 3 conferred knights. All of them are around level 25. Are you sure you want to go? Isn't it very interesting to be able to train the rebirth sword technique to the point where one's internal organs are weakened and one's life is in danger?" Fang Xingjian took a look at the address written on it, and with a light pinch, the piece of paper was torn into pieces by sword cheese. "I couldn't find them earlier. Since they've appeared this time around, I'll have to do some research on them." As he spoke, Ferdinand only felt a light breeze blowing past him, and Fang Xingjian had already disappeared into the night. Looking at the pitch-black night sky, Ferdinand seemed to be reminded of how Fang Xingjian had been in the past. In just a short 1.5 years, he's already grown to such a level. Right now, I probably won't even be able to withstand a single glance from him. After seeing Fang Xingjian again today, Fang Xingjian felt a little regretful about his decision to give up on focusing on his cultivation and gradually shift his focus to the background. Right now, he did not even know when Fang Xingjian had come or left. "My sharpness and sensitivity are getting worse and worse." Ferdinand pinched his forehead and sighed. "I hope that I didn't choose the wrong path." On the other hand, Fang Xingjian was moving very quickly, and in the blink of an eye, he had already arrived before a big house in the northwest corner. According to Ferdinand's information, the 3 severely injured apprentices were now placed here to recuperate and receive protection. Chapter 325. Fang Xingjian scanned the exterior of the house. Then, with a flash, he appeared at the back door of the house, as if he had teleported. At the same time, on the 3rd floor of the house, there were 3 young men and women lying on 3 beds. They were 3 apprentices whose internal organs had deteriorated and whose lives were in danger. One of the young ladies lay on the bed with a pale face. Her eyes were tightly shut, and her face was filled with agony. Large beads of perspiration dripped down from her forehead. 2 conferred knights dressed in knight attire stood at a corner of the bed. One of them, a conferred knight with a small mustache, threw a glance at the young lady who was gasping for breath and moaning. He shook his head and said, "The 3 of them probably won't be able to last till next month." Next to him, the other blue-haired conferred knight said, "Their internal organs are deteriorating and rotting bit by bit. This way of dying is too painful. Let's go. Don't disturb their rest." The 2 conferred knights both had heaven's perception, so it did not matter whether they were inside or outside the door. They walked out together and sat down. The small mustache asked, "Where's Madame Sally? She hasn't returned yet?" The blue-haired man replied, "No, she's gone to investigate the situation at One Intention Dojo." One Intention Dojo was the sword arts faction which had met with trouble this time around. It was also their head who had gotten 3 of the more outstanding students in the dojo to try and learn it after reading the rebirth sword technique in the Knight's Handbook. One Intention style. Over 10 years ago, it was one of the more powerful factions in the Great Western City, right? Over the past 10 years or so, it has deteriorated greatly, the small mustache said. But it feels a little strange for him to get 3 of the most outstanding students to cultivate the rebirth sword technique at one go. What's so strange about it? The blue-haired man said, "They've deteriorated too much." He said that if there isn't a single knight to be born by next year, even their rights to read the Knight's Handbook will be revoked. The head must have believed in the effects of the rebirth sword technique and gotten the 3 most outstanding students to practice it. He's planning on using the excuse of not paying the authorization fee as an excuse to wait for the 3 students to get good results in the prefectural selection next year. In the end, 3 people just happen to be crippled. The small mustache man's lips twitched. They're really unlucky. The 2 of them were the adjutants who had rushed over to the Great Western City together with the arbitrator, Sally. They were also people from a night association and were in charge of assisting Sally in hosting the charge. However, compared to Sally, who was not even 30 years old, both the man with the mustache and the man with the blue hair were over 40 years old. They were also level 24 conferred knights and were considered to be the backbone of the conferred knights. Just as they were talking, a middle-aged woman came over. The woman's face was full of wrinkles, and she was wearing coarse clothes. She looked uneasy under the light. She said timidly and nervously, I think we'd better forget it this time. Can you stop the arbitration?" This commoner lady was clearly the mother of one of the 3 apprentices. Hearing her question, the 2 conferred knights exchanged a glance. In the end, it was the man with the mustache who said, "You don't have to worry. We represent the Knight Association. No one will dare to take revenge on you. But I heard that Fang Xinjian is a genius that has not appeared in the Great Western region for the past 1,000 years. I've even read his books. A character like this. How can we go against such a character?" The lady continued to clench her fists, and her tone became increasingly nervous and uneasy. Seeing how the woman was behaving, the man with the mustache explained patiently, "You don't have to worry about Fang Xinjian. We're all level 24 conferred knights. All of us skipped over the regional academies and trained hard in the Knight Association in the Central Region. You might have heard of our names before. I'm Heaven-Shaking Sword Potter." He patted his back, and a great sword that was over 2 meters long let out clanking sounds. He then pointed to the blue-haired man and said, "This is Baroque Sword Marcus, and Fang Xinjian is just a conferred knight who has just transitioned not too long ago. With us around, he won't be able to do anything to you guys. You don't have to worry." This time around, the arbitration was for the rebirth sword technique, and the 3 arbitrators that were sent over were naturally people who cultivated sword arts. Heaven-Shaking Sword Potter and Baroque Sword Marcus, these 2 conferred knights were also people with some fame in the Central Region. Heaven-Shaking Sword Potter and Baroque Sword Marcus were both conferred knights who had quite a bit of fame in the Central Region. Or perhaps it was the Baroque Sword. Marcus had once stabbed 12,005 times in 10 minutes, stopping the ferocious beast from besieging the city and saving tens of thousands of people. Furthermore, the 2 of them later became the Golden Partners and had worked together to deal with many night cases. 3 years ago, they had even worked together to capture a level 24 conferred knight who had defected to the north. Under the pursuit of assassins from the north, they had successfully brought the criminal back to the imperial capital. Although the woman was a commoner, she had heard of their deeds. Hearing this, she finally felt a little more at ease. However, she still said with some fear, "But it's rumored that the second prince is backing Fang Xinjian. What if His Majesty the second prince gets angry at what we've done? What should we do?" Seeing that the woman looked like she was about to cry, The blue-haired Marcus said impatiently. All right, don't think too much about this. Our Knight Association is very particular about enforcing the law impartially. Even if a prince were to break the law, he would be punished the same as a commoner. If it's really proven that Fang Xingjian's rebirth sword technique has caused his internal organs to deteriorate, then even the second prince won't be able to save him. With that, he waved his hand and got the woman to quickly go back to rest. After the woman left, the mustache potter said, "Why do you have to be so crude? This woman is very worried right now. You should give her a good explanation." The blue-haired Marcus said, "She's just a commoner. To be honest, regardless of whether she's angry, nervous, worried, or any other emotions, they won't affect the situation at all. Your heart isn't a mess." Heaven-shaking sword potter asked, "Aren't you in a mess?" Baroque sword Marcus let out a breath and said, "Although Fang Xingjian's talent is very strong, it hasn't been completely converted into his battle prowess. The terrifying ones are the people standing behind him. You've sensed it during the time you've been in the great western city, right? It's been very difficult." Heaven-shaking sword potter frowned and said, "Almost every place we go and everything we do are being monitored. Even this house took us a lot of effort to get our hands on it. Putting aside the various rude treatment we've received on the way here, we haven't even been able to meet James and Governor Devitt until now. Moreover, don't you feel that the waters are really that deep this time around? Both you and I cultivate sword arts. At the very least, in terms of sword theories, the rebirth sword technique definitely won't cause one's internal organs to deteriorate. This matter should have been kept under wraps for the time being and investigated slowly. However, with such great fanfare and almost going against the Great Western Region Regional Academy, it's clear that they want to cut the Gordian knot and get all the organizations to stop their research on the rebirth sword technique." Saying that, heaven-shaking sword potter let out a breath and said, "Right now, the entire upper echelon of the Empire knows about the rebirth sword technique. To think that only the three of us have been sent here, especially Sally. Although she's quite talented, she's too young and her experience is a little lacking." Chapter 326. You've sensed it as well. Baroque sword Marcus said, "You should understand that if the rebirth sword technique is real, then it could change the entire empire. No, it could change the entire world's way of cultivating. If such a thing were to appear, do you think, all right." When Baroque sword said that, heaven-shaking sword potter felt his hair stand on end. If the rebirth sword technique was real, then what effect would it have on the entire world's martial prowess? If it was real, then what would happen to the nurturing sword techniques from other factions? Then what would happen to the experts who had signed the nurturing sword techniques? And what would the government think when faced with the people from the middle and lower levels, as well as the knights and knight apprentices who were about to receive a huge leap in their abilities? Thinking of this, Marcus broke out in cold sweat. This time around, he had really been dragged into a huge whirlpool. What he could not understand was why they had only sent level 24 and 25 conferred knights like them over for such a huge matter. What on earth were the higher-ups planning? The two of them did not know what to do. It was because they had not received any orders and did not know what they should be biased towards. Moreover, the higher-ups had sent Sally, a woman who was easily moved and was also filled with righteousness. It seemed to be a form of attitude in itself. Just as the two of them were deep in thought, Fang Xingjian's voice rang out from the staircase. "I see. You guys don't know the exact situation either? Who's that?" With an explosive bellow, Baroque sword Marcus and heaven-shaking sword potter both looked toward Fang Xingjian. Crackling sounds of explosions rang out in the air, and the surrounding walls seemed as if they had been hit by an air bomb, with a large area of cracks appearing. Just the slight agitation of their reduced force fields seemed as if they were about to tear down the entire house. A lady's scream rang out, and the lady who had come to ask earlier rushed to Baroque's sword side and asked, "What's wrong? What happened?" Baroque's sword Marcus bellowed, "Don't move recklessly if you don't wish to die." The two of them looked toward Fang Xingjian and asked, "Who are you?" "Me? Aren't I the person you guys are looking for?" Fang Xingjian walked slowly toward the two conferred knights, as if he was taking a leisurely stroll in the garden. However, the countenances of the two conferred knights changed. They stared at Fang Xingjian and asked, "Fang Xingjian, why are you here? The arbitration will begin in 3 days. What are you trying to do?" Fang Xingjian's feet stopped at the boundary of their reduced force fields and said calmly, "Don't be nervous. I'm only here to take a look at the 3 injured kids and find out the reason for their injuries." Heaven-shaking Sword Potter said coldly, "Go back. It's impossible for us to let you meet." Right at this moment, the middle-aged woman's expression changed drastically. She looked at Fang Xingjian and stammered, You are Fang Xingjian. What do you want to do? Are you here to kill us?" Fang Xingjian frowned as he looked at the woman and asked, "Who is he?" "He's a family member of one of the victims." Heaven-shaking Sword Potter said, "Marcus, bring Madame Daly back. I alone will be enough." The middle-aged woman, who was addressed as Madame Daly, was on the verge of breaking down. Tears gushed out incessantly as she looked at Fang Xingjian and shouted, "Fang Xingjian, haven't you caused enough harm to my son? You're still thinking of killing him? I beg of you, please let us off. We don't want the arbitration anymore." Baroque Sword Marcus shook his head. Looking at the woman who was speaking incoherently and even contradicting herself, he picked her up with one hand, wanting to bring her away. However, Heaven-shaking Sword Potter looked at Fang Xingjian from afar and said, "Mr. Fang, why are you in a daze? Do you want me to send you away personally?" Fang Xingjian did not say a word. He just opened up his 5 fingers, and a stream of aquatic sword chi turned into a water sword in his hand. "I'm not in a daze. It's just that there are too many ways to defeat you. It's hard for me to choose." Humph. Heaven-shaking Sword Potter let out a cold snort, drew out the huge sword that was over 2 meters long from his back, gritted his teeth, and said, "Arrogant brat, my level is higher than yours. My slaughter experience is 100 times more than yours, and the battles I've participated in are more than the meals you've eaten. What right do you have to fight against me? Go back quickly. I don't want others to find trouble with me after I injure you." No matter how much battle experience a weakling has, it's just experience from fighting against weaklings. After saying this, Fang Xingjian suddenly appeared behind Heaven-shaking Sword Potter, sending over 10 streams of ether sword ripples sweeping out. How fast was Fang Xingjian's current speed? With his 224 agility attribute, single sword world subjugation, and boundaries negation, his speed was not even 15 times that of supersonic speed. Additionally, the ether sword ripples could unleash a slash that was 5 times that of Fang Xingjian's strength. Moreover, after Fang Xingjian's growth and tempering after his job transition, his strength attribute had already reached 123 points, reaching the average standard of a low-tiered conferred knight. Right now, as the ether sword ripples swept out, Heaven-shaking Sword was unable to react to the slash that was 15 times that of supersonic speed. He was sent flying, covered in blood, and landed on the ground. Of course, although it seemed like he had lost a lot of blood, Fang Xingjian had already avoided the vital parts. To Heaven-shaking Sword, who was a conferred knight, it was just a superficial wound. Potter rolled on the ground and let out a furious bellow. His entire body swelled up as if he was congested with blood. He raised his huge sword high up, wanting to once again charge out toward Fang Xingjian. Just then, Fang Xingjian somehow appeared before him, and a water sword took advantage of the loophole in his movements. It instantly pierced through his body and stuck close to his heart, not moving at all. Sensing the feeling of the sword cheese sticking close to his heart, Heaven-shaking Sword did not dare to move at all. Fang Xingjian then let go of his hand, and the water sword formed from the aquatic sword cheese turned into a lump, wrapping around Heaven-shaking Sword's heart. Fang Xingjian whispered into Heaven-shaking Sword's ear, "Stay here obediently. I'm not here to kill anyone today." Heaven-shaking Sword's face was flushed red. He had not even unleashed 10% of his powers, yet he had been defeated so easily. He was covered in shame and fury. However, just then, another bang rang out. Fong Xingjian turned back and saw that Baroque's sword Marcus had unknowingly fallen to the ground. Madame Daly was slowly drawing out a dagger from his body. She chuckled. Thank goodness this guy isn't at level 25. Otherwise, it'd be troublesome for his body to regenerate. He wouldn't be able to lie down so quietly like now. Chapter 327. At the sight of this scene, heaven-shaking Sword Potter was infuriated and bellowed furiously. *TCH. Let him go. Oh, why should I let him go? And compared to that, shouldn't you be more worried about yourself? The female assassin smiled. Fong Xingjian said, You're thinking of framing me after killing them? In that instant, Fong Xingjian finally understood some things. Why the other party only sent level 25 and level 24 conferred knights over. It was because the other party had no intention of discussing sword theories or reasoning with him. It had been the same when Rhoda Clan's old ancestor had come to talk to him earlier, and it was the same for this woman. He could imagine that after killing this woman, there would be even more pressure. When the woman heard Fong Xingjian's words, she smiled and said, As expected of a great genius from the great Western region. You reacted so quickly? I was just following them, but since you've come knocking on my head, it means that the conversation between you and Old Black has failed. Then I can only let you kill them and escape, bearing the crime of treason. If this woman were to really do as she said, killing heaven-shaking sword and Baroque sword, and then framing Fong Xingjian, then this arbitration would be a victory without a fight. Putting aside the rebirth sword technique, even Fong Xingjian himself would become a prisoner, perfectly avoiding a debate on sword arts. The female assassin pulled out the dagger from Baroque's sword's back and stepped on his body. However, he did not move at all. The dagger pierced through Baroque's sword's heart and crushed his entire chest. This conferred knight died completely before he could even react. A level 24 conferred knight's vitality was very strong. Compared to ordinary people, he was like a monster. However, with his entire chest crushed, it was impossible for him to survive. Looking at this scene, heaven-shaking sword clenched his teeth and said coldly, Fong Xingjian, let go of me. I'll capture this *TCH with you. The female assassin chuckled and said, Do you really think that you have a chance of winning? After saying that, her face changed slightly, revealing the face of a beautiful woman with a sweet smile. Even her figure and height changed. She became a model who was 8 meters tall and had a curvaceous figure. She didn't look like a middle-aged woman at all. Body modification? You're a level 25 conferred knight? Heaven-shaking sword's countenance sank as he felt an immense pressure gushing toward him. Level 25 conferred knights could already see the existence of cells through heaven's perception. With this as a foundation, they could modify their bodies and obtain all sorts of unbelievable powers, allowing the prowess of their killing techniques to increase tremendously. In terms of destructive prowess, vitality, and other aspects, a level 25 conferred knight would completely crush a level 24 conferred knight. Hearing his shock, the woman laughed. That's right. Do you think you still have hope now? She looked at Fong Xingjian and said, What do you think? Fong Xingjian, this time around, his influence has far surpassed your imagination. There's no way you'll have a chance of winning. If you surrender now, you can follow me back to the imperial capital. There'll be an even better job waiting for you. Fong Xingjian asked, Do you think that you'll be able to stop the rebirth sword technique? The beautiful woman let out a cold laugh and said, Why? Do you think that you're very innocent and that we're very evil? Do you think that your rebirth sword technique will push society forward? You're too childish. You don't understand anything at all. The rebirth sword technique will increase the strength of everyone in the world. Based on the central government's calculations, if the rebirth sword technique is allowed to continue spreading, then the average attributes of anyone on the streets will exceed 15 points. Do you know what this means? It means that anyone on the streets will be able to lift a horse carriage, knock down walls, leap onto roofs and vault over walls, and tear apart tigers and leopards. A society like this will be in complete chaos. Everyone will be able to release the desires in their hearts after obtaining great power. Ordinary armies and city guards won't be able to hold them back. Influences such as bandits will increase rapidly, and each faction will even become an independent kingdom. What your rebirth sword technique will bring will not be the progress of society, but the chaos and war of the entire world. It will be the source of some disasters. Is that so? Is that what you guys think? Isn't that so? The woman shook her head and looked at Fang Xingjian with eyes filled with pity. Now that you understand the severity of the matter, you should understand that the entire empire's upper echelon will never allow you to continue pushing the rebirth sword technique. You won't have a future, unless you want to go against the entire world. The entire world? Fang Xingjian let out a cold laugh and said, "Can you guys represent the entire world? The country is ruled by the strong, and the empire's upper echelon represents the country's will. Right now, you're going against the entire country's will. If you carry on like this, the only outcome for you is to die horribly. There's no other possibility." Fang Xingjian did not reply, but he suddenly thought of Bruno. This Italian thinker had been burned at the stake for defending the heliocentric theory. It was also because the Roman Church had been trying to maintain their own interests back then. Although Fang Xingjian's current situation was not completely the same as his, there were still some similarities. This guy's in a daze? Seeing how Fang Xingjian appeared to be deep in thought and was clearly in a daze, the female assassin's gaze narrowed. However, she did not give up on this opportunity and moved at the next instant. There was no sound of the wind, no tremors or whistling in the air. Before any sound could reach the ears of humans, the female assassin had already dashed up to Fang Xingjian and thrust out the dagger in her hand at an extremely high speed, aiming for Fang Xingjian's heart. Moreover, this thrust of hers was not just a simple thrust. The dagger also contained over 100 stack forces. If it were to hit its target, it would be enough to ignite a person and explode like a bag of dynamite. To her, it was a simple action of sprinting or dashing. However, in the eyes of the heaven-shaking sword, it was just a flash of after-images. I've succeeded. The female assassin was very clear on how fast she could accelerate at full speed. The force of this thrust was 12 times that of supersonic speed, which was equivalent to her moving at a speed of several kilometers in the blink of an eye. Right now, she was only a palm's length away from Fang Xingjian, and there was no way for her to block it. However, just as she was thinking of this, a finger gently pressed against the tip of her dagger. Fang Xingjian, who had the Heavenly Abyss Annihilation armor, used the tip of his finger to gently block this thrust. At the next moment, strong gales howled and sword cheese ran amok. Sparks flew in the air from the high-speed friction, and the shock waves created many large holes in the surrounding walls. Even the roof of the entire house was blown off by the violent shock waves. All of this was merely the remnant force from the 20 ether sword ripples slashing onto the female assassin's body. Chapter 328. The woman was sent flying into the sky by the 20 streams of ether sword ripples. The parts of her that had been slashed released explosive sounds, but there was no trace of blood at all. It was as if her body was not made of flesh but metal. Be careful, Fang Xingjian. She's at level 25, and her ether synchronization rate is over 60%. Under the circumstances where her body has been modified, she can already condense specialties. Her body is almost no different from a superior divine weapon. Fang Xingjian frowned slightly. He could sense that streams of aura were extending out from the other party's body. Over 20 streams of aura rose up from the other party's body like smoke signals soaring into the sky. In the surrounding void space, there were also waves gushing toward her body incessantly. There were about 30 streams of aura. As these auras extended out, the pressure Fang Xingjian gave her suddenly increased by several times. The female assassin even stopped in midair, stepping on the air as if she was walking on flat ground. She smiled coldly and said, "Fang Xingjian, it's true that your abilities have slightly surpassed my expectations. It seems that conferred knights below level 25 will no longer be able to deal with you. However, you still don't understand how strong a level 25 conferred knight is. When a conferred knight reaches level 21, they can see other people's emotions through their brainwaves. At level 22, they can see sound waves and light waves, possessing powerful observational abilities. At level 23, they can decipher the heavenly thunders and terrestrial magnetism forces, using the power of thunderbolts to temper their bodies, greatly increasing their toughness. They can even float in midair. At level 24, they can see the radiation of all living things, directly absorb the power emitted by ether particles, and store it, greatly increasing the prowess of their killing techniques. However, your talent is too great, and it erases the gap between you and a level 24 conferred knight in terms of the toughness of your body and the prowess of your killing techniques. However, at level 25, it's different. At this stage, conferred knights can grasp the most minute details in their bodies. Not only can they simply modify their bodies, but they can also condense specialty seeds. In the consciousness, skill seeds can be synthesized into skills. In the physical body, specialty seeds can allow the body to continue to evolve. There are 1,440 internal specializations and 9,270 external specializations. With each specialty they condense into a specialty seed, they can unleash new potential in the human body. At this stage, starting from level 25 conferred knights, our physical bodies have already far surpassed yours. We are moving towards God from a human. As she spoke, the woman casually tossed the dagger out. She clenched her fingers together, as if she had turned into the sharpest sword in the world. In the next moment, there was a loud explosion under her feet. She stomped on the air and charged towards Fang Xingjian. Fang Xingjian understood the power of specialties very well. He himself had more than 10 specialties, which had greatly enhanced his physical body and swordsmanship. After all, various specialties could greatly increase a person's strength, speed, reaction, flexibility, endurance, and other qualities. Moreover, the 50 streams of aura emitted from the lady meant that she had over 50 specialty seeds. How terrifying would the physical body of such a person be? At this moment, her speed and strength had already exceeded 200 points. In terms of physical attributes, she was even stronger than Curse Headmaster, whom Fang Xingjian had encountered in the past. She was a conferred knight who focused on cultivating her physical body and did not pay attention to other aspects. The air within a range of 100 meters seemed to have been split into two with her dash. Her palms seemed to have turned into a long spear that could pierce through everything, piercing out toward Fang Xingjian's chest. However, before she could really hit him, her body was hit by another 50 streams of ether sword ripples, and she was sent flying with a bang. The female assassin, who was in midair, laughed out loud. "It's useless, Fang Xingjian. My physical body has been thoroughly tempered. It's impossible for you to win." She lifted her thigh high and slammed her leg downwards like a tomahawk. Layers of air were directly blasted apart, sputtering ripples and airwaves that filled the sky. Amidst the surging wind, even the rows of trees in the surroundings were directly blown away, and the dozen or so carriages on the street were directly blasted away. Killing technique, comet descent. Through the stimulation of ether particles, one could unleash a kick that was several tens of times stronger than the original. It was said to be a kick that could even kick down meteors. Faced with this descending kick technique, Fang Xingjian's countenance did not change. He tapped out with his finger, and this time around, 100 streams of ether sword ripples soared into the air simultaneously, clashing fiercely against the female assassin's comet descent. With an explosive rumble, it was as if over 10,000 kilograms of gunpowder had exploded. The female assassin felt as if her body had collided against an incoming aircraft carrier. The speed and strength that she was so proud of were completely useless at this moment. How is this possible? What kind of power is this? Fresh blood spurted out from all over her body, and she landed on the ground with a loud bang. She looked at Fang Xingjian in disbelief. What kind of move is that? Why does it have such a strong prowess? Fang Xingjian walked over slowly and said, "If it wasn't for the fact that I wanted to capture you alive, you would have died long ago. Compared to the level 25 conferred knights I've met in the past, you're too weak. If it's as you said, that the strong represent the country's will, then wouldn't those who are stronger than you be able to represent the country better? That's right. Compare to Huang Lin, whom Fang Xingjian had fought before, and Curse Headmaster, who was at level 26, other than having a stronger body. This female assassin was too weak in other aspects." Hearing Fang Xingjian's words, the female assassin instantly reacted. The reason why Fang Xingjian had increased the prowess of his attacks time and time again was to test her limits in order to capture her alive. Of course, it was also because Fang Xingjian was too powerful right now. With 123 points in his strength attribute, and the ether sword ripples that had the effect of 5 times his strength. Each additional stream of ether sword ripples he released was equivalent to an additional slash with 5 times his strength. The 100 streams of ether sword ripples earlier were equivalent to a slash with 250 times of Fang Xingjian's strength, which allowed him to crush the female assassin easily. The female assassin looked at Fang Xingjian with a complicated expression. "To think that I would lose to you." The next moment, she bounced up abruptly, and with a slight movement, she had already escaped over 100 meters away. At level 25, her vitality and recovery abilities were too strong. After resting for a few breaths' time, she had already recovered 80% of her battle prowess. She once again unleashed her full power, wanting to escape. She dashed out just like that, knocking through over 10 layers of walls with loud bangs, bringing up dust and smoke. In the blink of an eye, she had already arrived at a street several hundred meters away. The speed at which a conferred knight moved was too fast. Such mobility was not something that a knight could match up to. With a single dash, they would usually be able to cover a distance of several hundred or even several thousand meters. However, the next moment, a sword descended from the sky, slashing out toward her head. So fast, he's already caught up. How can he be so fast? The female assassin did not have the time to consider these thoughts. She let out a loud bellow, and her entire body swelled up as if she had been inflated. Her right leg rose up into the sky and collided with the sword's edge, emitting a state of being able to support the heavens and earth. An official leg technique, supporting the heavens, borrowed the power of the Earth's rotation to fend off an opponent who was descending from the sky. It was a leg technique that was said to be able to hold on even if the sky were to collapse. However, the instant the sword's edge came into contact with the sole of her foot, the female assassin felt that this sword seemed to be even heavier than the heavens. This was an outburst of 150 streams of ether sword ripples, an outburst of 375 times the strength of Fang Xingjian. With an agonizing cry, one of the female assassin's feet was slashed off. As blood splattered out, her face was filled with shock and terror. However, she still dashed out a few kilometers in the blink of an eye at a supersonic speed of over 3,000 meters per second. Heaven-shaking Sword Potter saw this scene the moment he chased after her. Then he heard Fang Xingjian say softly, "You stay here and don't move. When the other Confer Knights come, just say whatever they have to say." As he said that, he dashed out, bringing up a gush of white air currents. He was like a supersonic fighter jet, skimming past the great western city at a low altitude. Not long after Fang Xingjian left, a few more figures descended from the sky. Their auras were like the depths of the ocean, causing heaven-shaking Sword Potter to almost want to prostrate himself in worship. Chapter 329. In the outskirts of the great western city, over 30 kilometers away, over 100 torches were lit up in a pitch-black mountain cave. A level 29 conferred knight, who was in the 3rd tier amongst the level 29 conferred knights, stood in the cave with a cold expression, looking at the other 3 second transition knights before him. "Tell me, why have you guys asked me to come here?" Sasa looked coldly at the fatso before him, a huge man with a height of over 2 meters but a weight of over 500 jin. Gargantuan Gao Tu, you should have died in prison a long time ago. Gao Tu, who was addressed as Gargantuan Gao Tu, laughed out loud. He grabbed a chicken drumstick and nibbled on it as he said, "Hee hee, Sasa, don't you understand? Second transition characters are treasures no matter what. How could the people above let us die so easily? They can't wait to squeeze us dry." Sasa looked at him coldly and said, "Gargantuan Gao Tu, a Westerner, the #1 expert of the Giant Spirit sect. However, 10 years ago, he betrayed the Giant Spirit sect and massacred 1,200 members of the Giant Spirit sect. Thereafter, he committed murder and killed over 10,000 people, even killing 3 conferred knights. He was then arrested by the Knight Association and sentenced to death. However, there are also rumors that you've been bought over by the School of Sword Arts. It seems that it's true, as expected of a sword saint." Gao Tu clapped his oily palms and said, "Since you know that I'm sent by the School of Sword Arts, then there's no need for me to explain any further, right? Since you're the one who started this, then you'll have to end this." Sasa's eyes narrowed abruptly, and there seemed to be streams of sword light flowing within them. The other party clearly knew that he was the one who had reported the hidden injuries of the rebirth sword technique to the association. This was equivalent to firing the first shot, giving everyone an excuse to push for this matter. Sasa said coldly, "I don't understand what you guys mean." Of course, he was willing to be the first to fire the first shot. This could help him prevent Fang Xingjian from deciphering the dragon scale, helping him to unravel the profoundness of the dragon scale. However, if he were to end this matter, he would have to take on the Great Western Region's Governor Devitt, Head of Department James, and Hops from the Sword Tower. How could he possibly be so foolish as to charge out and become cannon fodder? Now that the higher-ups didn't send any powerful figures, it was obvious that those big shots were incomparably slippery. No one wanted to come down and confront the 3 local bullies. Governor Devitt and Governor James from 2 generations ago had managed to forge the entire Great Western region into an impenetrable fortress. Who would be willing to go up against them head-on? Naturally, Sword Saint Sasa was unwilling as well. Gao Tu laughed maniacally and said, "Who do you think sent me?" This time, the order was given by the Supreme Chief. If you were to reject it, we will first leak the news of you reporting the information, and you will also become the enemy of the School of Sword Arts. Think carefully, Sword Saint. Gao Tu emphasized the word Sword Saint as if it was filled with mockery and provocation. Sasa looked at this fat pig before him, trying his best to suppress his anger. Gao Tu was merely a level 25 conferred knight. In theory, Sasa would be able to kill him with a few sword attacks. However, he did not dare to do so. It was because of the School of Sword Arts and because of the title of Supreme Chief. The second transition experts of the School of Sword Arts were divided into elders, who were at the lowest position, messengers, headmasters, and the Supreme Chief, who held the highest position. The Supreme Chief of the School of Sword Arts was the strongest swordsman in the School of Sword Arts, as well as the highest ruler. The Supreme Chief of the School of Sword Arts this time around was called Hung Tianxiao. He was a man who stood at the top of the Empire's sword arts. Although he was not at the divine level, he was in the top tier amongst those at level 29. He was someone who could exchange blows with the First Prince, and was known as the God of Sword Arts by the disciples of the School of Sword Arts. Even Sasa would not dare to offend such a person easily. Moreover, Hung Tianxiao was merely the one who had appeared. Who knew who was behind him and how many people were supporting him? Sasa said calmly, "Devitt, James, and Hops. With the 3 of them working together, it would be impossible for me to suppress Fang Xingjian and the rebirth sword technique. Don't worry, it'll be fine as long as you appear." Gao Tu smiled and passed a letter to Sasa. "This is the Supreme Chief's judgment on the rebirth sword technique. You'll have to bring it out during the arbitration. By then, the people from the Myriad Stars Palace will also make a move, and Fang Xingjian will have no hope. As for the government, the First Prince has already made his preparations." Myriad Stars Palace? Hearing these three words, Sasa's heart trembled slightly. If the School of Sword Arts was said to be the pinnacle in the sword arts domain, then the Myriad Stars Palace was an even more terrifying force due to the existence of the divine-level expert, the astral ancestor. Right now, the School of Sword Arts, the Myriad Stars Palace, and the First Prince were all going to suppress Feng Xingjian. Devitt, James, and Holt would probably not be able to stop them either. Gao Tu continued, still hesitating? After the rebirth sword technique is banned, the Myriad Stars Palace, the School of Sword Arts, and the Ancient Path of Hell, Royal Sect, will jointly invent a new sword technique for the three great sects to cultivate. Do you want to be known as one of the creators of this sword technique and leave your name in history? Hearing this, Sasa was also slightly taken aback. He felt a chill in his heart at this plan of the three great sections. They want to deal a blow to Feng Xingjian and the rebirth sword technique, banning everyone from cultivating it. They'll then change the sword technique's appearance and circulate it within their three sects. This way, their business of imparting martial techniques won't be affected, and their sex abilities will increase tremendously. The difference in abilities between the upper echelons and the lower echelons will also be widened, and the royal family's rule over the lower echelons will also be more stable. As expected, they're more than 10 times more ruthless than me. They're really vicious. However, Sasa suddenly thought that the person who had invented this new sword technique would definitely be one from each of the three sections. If he could join them as well, then with the effects of the rebirth sword technique, he would definitely be able to leave his name in history. They're really not leaving behind any benefits. But I like it, Gao Tu said impatiently. How about it? Can you agree to it now? Sasa shrugged. I don't seem to have any grounds to reject, right? With the three great sects joining forces, it was true that there was no longer any possibility for Sasa to reject them. After handing the letter to Sasa and watching the Sword Saint leave, a skinny man next to Gao Tu said, Boss Gao, this lad won't go back on his word and slip away, right? Do you think that he dares to? Gao Tu smiled coldly and said, The School of Sword Arts, the Myriad Stars Palace, the First Prince. If any of the influences wanted to crush him, it wouldn't be much harder than killing a dog. With him as the blade, if anything were to happen in the future, there would be someone to take the blame. Not long after their discussion, the female assassin dashed into the cave, covered in blood. She fell to the ground. What's wrong, Rakshasa? How did you suffer such serious injuries? The female assassin, who was known as Rakshasa, kept repeating Feng Xingjian's last sword attack in her mind. I can't block it. I can't block it at all. Chapter 330. You're saying that you attacked from below with the heaven supporting kick, but when he slashed down with his sword, you weren't even able to fend it off, and even your leg was slashed off. Gao Tu frowned, looked at Rakshasi, and asked, Based on our intel, Feng Xingjian is at most level 22. How is it possible that you weren't even able to fend off a single sword attack from him? Rakshasi touched the soles of her feet. The soles of her feet, which had already grown back, had skin that was like that of a baby's. This was the powerful vitality of a level 25 conferred knight, in addition to the specialty she already had, which allowed her to regrow her feet. However, this was unable to conceal the hint of fear in her eyes. I really couldn't fend it off. I stimulated all the specialty seeds throughout my body and even used the heaven-supporting kick, borrowing the power of the Earth's movement. With such power, even if a building were to come crashing down, I'd have the confidence to shatter it into pieces. However, when Feng Xingjian's sword attack came crashing down, it was as if the sky had really come crashing down. There was no power that could fend it off. Gao Tu frowned and said, It's said that Feng Xingjian has a sword move that absorbs and transforms gravity. Could it be this move? Rakshasi shook her head. No, I didn't sense any changes in gravity. Just then, the entire cave trembled violently. It was as if waves of tremendous force had descended from the sky, causing the cave to tremble and shatter into pieces. Rakshasi looked toward the outside of the cave. As expected, he followed me here. Boss Gao, you guys must help me take revenge. Rakshasi was not a fool. Of course, she knew that Fang Xingjian had been chasing after her because he wanted to find her companions. However, she was even more confident that with the help of her companions, she would definitely be able to avenge herself and teach Fang Xingjian a good lesson. Gao Tu frowned slightly. He did not really want to make a move to capture Fang Xingjian now. It was because only by letting him attend the arbitration and defeat him with his authority would the rebirth sword technique be strictly banned, and the number of people who cultivated this sword technique would be reduced to the greatest extent. He was already very displeased with Rakshasi's reckless attacks, and now he did not want to make a move against Fang Xingjian. Therefore, he looked at the other two conferred knights next to him and asked, "Will he be able to enter?" The two conferred knights were covered in gray cloaks and looked like two sculptures. Now that Gao Tu was asking them, they lifted their heads in unison, revealing two identical faces. Both of them were bald, without eyebrows, and there was the same snake tattoo on the left side of their faces. The twins, Zhang Zhua and Zhang Yu, were also level 24 confer knights. However, Gao Tu and Rakshasi did not dare to underestimate them. It was because the two of them had been of the same mind since they were young. It was said that they shared the same consciousness and could even cultivate a set of techniques that could be combined together. They were proficient in willpower impacts and related killing techniques. However, because they had failed to break through the level 25 barrier, the two of them had become slightly deranged. This was what made Rakshasa's daughter and Gao Tu even more wary of them. No one was willing to fight with a lunatic who was not afraid of death. Upon hearing Gao Tu's question, Zhang Zhua said, "We've injected information into the plants and rocks outside to set up the Mirage Sea array. He won't be able to find us." Rakshasa gritted her teeth and said, "Are we going to hide from him?" Although Fang Xingjian's battle prowess had far surpassed her imagination, there were 4 conferred knights present. How could she possibly be afraid of Fang Xingjian? "We'll go out and subdue him now and bring him back to the headquarters. If he can't attend the arbitration the day after tomorrow, it'll be considered a defeat without a fight." "Idiot," Gao Tu scolded. "What do you think the higher-ups are doing by making so many preparations? If capturing Fang Xingjian would be of use, the higher-ups would have taken action long ago. Our goal is to get most people to not cultivate or research the rebirth sword technique. Just stay here and don't make a move. There's no need to be anxious. This genius won't be active for much longer. He's destined to lose all his reputation in the arbitration 3 days later. By then, no matter where he goes, he'll be destined to live in darkness for the rest of his life." Just as they were speaking, the entire world suddenly became lighter. Gao Tu sensed his floating body, and his countenance changed. "This guy, is he crazy? Let's go." Gao Tu had done extensive research on Fang Xingjian's records. The lethality of that move, which Fang Xingjian had inherited from the Pantheon Monument, was far too strong. Even Gao Tu would not be able to take it head-on. Moreover, they were now staying in the cave. A single slash from Fang Xingjian would have the effect of an earthquake. If they did not leave, they would end up being buried alive. A few minutes ago, heaven-shaking sword potter saw a few majestic figures descending from the sky, and he was astonished. The person in the lead was the deputy governor who had been in charge of the regional selections examiner back then, Armstrong, whose face was filled with scars. He threw a glance at heaven-shaking sword potter. Potter was about to speak when Armstrong sent him a voice transmission. "Shut up. If you don't wish to die, then shut up." It was only at this moment that heaven-shaking sword potter saw Armstrong's gaze clearly. It was filled with raging, killing intent. Deputy Governor Armstrong. It was as if a bolt of lightning had struck Potter's mind, and he instantly understood. This Armstrong, he's also from the higher-ups? Damn it, he's the deputy governor of the Great Western Region. Or could it be that there are different voices within the Second Prince's Reformist Party? That's right. One of the advantages of conferred knights is that they can keep on synthesizing martial techniques. This allows them to surpass knights and apprentices in terms of nurturing and tempering their attributes. However, the existence of the rebirth sword technique has caused this difference to disappear. Therefore, there should be many conferred knights who feel uneasy about this sword technique. They wouldn't like a sword technique that can close the gap between them and the people below them. Moreover, the first prince is about to attain the divine level. It's obvious that there are people under the second prince who wish to switch sides. Just as these thoughts flashed through heaven-shaking Sword Potter's mind, a long whistle rang out. Arbitrator Sally had already rushed over. Looking at the collapsed house and the ruins all over the ground, she clenched her fists tightly. What's going on? Who attacked this place? Are the children all right? They're fine. They've been protected, Armstrong said calmly. Sally frowned and threw him a glance. She did not really like the officials of the Great Western region. She looked at Potter and asked, "What's going on? Who attacked this place?" Potter lifted his head and saw that Armstrong, who was behind Sally, was looking at him with a gaze as if he was looking at a dead man. The warning in Armstrong's gaze was self-evident. Damn it! Potter clenched his fists tightly as an intense battle raged in his mind. If I were to tell them the truth, I'll probably be killed. As expected, they're thinking of using Officer Sally as a weapon. After all, she's of the northern bloodline. Then what should I choose? Just as Potter's heart was struggling to the extreme, he finally let out a sigh of relief and said, "Sir, it's Fong." He suddenly saw Baroque Sword Marcus, who had been dug out from the ruins at the back. Looking at the corpse that was being carried on the carriage, his gaze suddenly flickered. He laughed out loud and suddenly shouted, "Sally, it's the upper." However, before he had the chance to finish his words, one of Armstrong's palms had already pressed down on his shoulder. An unparalleled impact of martial arts struck his mind, causing him to be unable to say another word. He could not even move his fingers. Damn it! I can't move. I can't speak. Move for me. Chapter 331. Armstrong's hand was pushed away by Sally very quickly. However, Potter realized that not only was he unable to speak, but there was also a surge of power controlling his body, controlling his physical body. A myriad of information currents flowed around in his brain, ceaselessly changing the signals in his brain and taking over the control his brain had over his physical body. What's going on? What killing technique is this? Controlling my physical body? Armstrong rubbed his forehead gently, controlling Potter's body with great proficiency. This was a killing technique from the ancient path of purgatory, a killing technique that only a few humans knew of, the small puppet technique. Potter was only in a daze for a moment before he returned to normal. "It's Fong Xingjian, sir." He started killing the moment he entered the house. His sword arts are too strong, and the two of us weren't able to stop him. Baroque Sword risked his life to protect them, preventing the 3 kids from being killed. Sally looked at the heaven-shaking sword in a daze. "Fong Xingjian," Potter continued. "Sir, Fong Xingjian is too strong. We need to request for reinforcements." Looking at this scene, Potter kept on bellowing in his heart, but he was unable to control his body at all. Stop it right now. Give me back my body. Damn it." His entire consciousness seemed to be trembling, but he was unable to break free from the control of the small puppet technique. Sally looked at Potter's face and suddenly said, "Potter, you're crying." Potter, who was being controlled, wiped away the tears on his face and said, "I'm fine. It's just dust that got into my eyes." However, the scene of Potter crying was deeply imprinted in Sally's mind. She was like an enraged lion, turning her head abruptly to look at Armstrong and saying furiously, "Did you hear that? Your genius, your precious Fong Xingjian, attacked my subordinate and killed him cruelly. He even attacked the victim. What are you guys still doing here? Go and capture him quickly." Armstrong smiled and said, "I'm sorry, I can't arrest another conferred knight based on this person's one-sided statement. There must be evidence for everything." Sally stared into Armstrong's eyes and said, "Great Western region, you guys really deserve to die. Haven't you guys thought about the consequences if this goes on?" Armstrong shrugged. "Sorry, I'll report this to the association when I get back. As for Fang Xingjian, I will capture him myself." Sally looked at the houses and streets that had been destroyed by Rakshasa's daughter and Fang Xingjian. Her voice was filled with anger. The loud noise just now came from that direction, right? Her body trembled slightly, and the clothes on her back were torn apart by streams of power. 6 light wings stretched out from the skin on her back. These light wings seemed to be formed from many paths of light. It was as if there was no physical structure to them, and they were dazzling and resplendent. There were even specks of starlight flashing back and forth as the wings of light flapped. Next, Sally leaped lightly and shot out like a meteor, shooting toward the direction Fang Xingjian was pursuing Rakshasi. The 6 light wings on her back were extremely special. Each time they flapped gently, they would not increase their speed. Instead, they would tremble and distort space, allowing her to pass through the natural gaps in space. Space could not be shattered, but it could be compressed. The 6 light wings on Sally's back actually had the ability to compress space. Both Fang Xingjian and Rakshasa had relied on their physical bodies to dash out at an extremely high speed. Along the way, they created a lot of destruction and also left behind a lot of traces for Sally to keep up with. After all, each step they took would create a huge crater, and it was too easy to leave behind traces. Each time Sally flapped her light wings lightly, she would fly out a distance of over 1,000 meters. In less than half a minute, she had already gotten close to where Gao Tu and the others were. However, after looking around, she was still unable to find Fang Xingjian. Where is he? Where has Fang Xingjian hidden himself? Sally looked around for a while, and at the next moment, she suddenly felt that her body had become lighter. Is this the move that Fang Xingjian learned from the Pantheon Monument? As an arbitrator, Sally had naturally looked through Fang Xingjian's information in detail. Now that her body, as well as the surrounding rocks and trees, had lost their gravity, she immediately realized what had happened. Who is Fang Xingjian fighting against? At the next moment, four silhouettes broke through the rock stratum 1,000 meters away, soaring up into the sky after sending up smoke and dust. Sally turned her head abruptly and looked above the 4 silhouettes. Fang Xingjian was holding onto the stone sword and raising it up high. An extremely heavy power was gathered on the sword, as if he was going to slash the entire ground in the next moment. Who are those 4 people? Sally's brows furrowed, and she was very puzzled by the battle before her. However, the enemy of an enemy was a friend. Regardless of why Fang Xingjian was fighting against those 4 people, it would not change Sally's mind to capture Fang Xingjian. After Gao Tu and the other 3 dashed out, they followed Gao Tu's instructions and fled in all directions. Gao Tu's body spewed out endless flames, and he darted toward the north like a fiery meteor. The twins, Zhang Zuo and Zhang Yu, each grabbed onto the other's arm, and waves of power flowed to and fro within their bodies. The 2 of them seemed to be moving very slowly, but in the blink of an eye, they had already dashed out a distance of several hundred meters. Rakshasi let out a furious bellow that was filled with indignation, humiliation, and fury. Fang Xingjian, treasure your final moments. She was the one who had been taught the worst by Fang Xingjian, and thus was the one who was the most unwilling to escape. This was especially so when the 4 of them had joined forces and clearly had the upper hand, yet they still wanted to escape. This made her even more furious. However, since Gao Tu was unwilling to fight against Fang Xingjian, she could only listen to his orders. However, just as the 4 of them were fleeing in all directions, a long howl rang out. Don't be afraid. I'll hold him back. We can join forces to capture him. As Sally spoke, she condensed a light sword in one of her hands, and, as she teleported, she circled around Fang Xingjian's body and stabbed out over 100 times consecutively. Fang Xingjian held onto the stone sword that was formed from the level 40 thunder, Hell's Word, in one hand. The power of terra ingurgitation was condensed on it, but it could only be used for one attack. Therefore, faced with Sally, who had suddenly appeared before him, and her attacks that were like a raging storm. Fang Xingjian put up his other hand sword fingers and tapped on the tip of the sword, using his finger as a sword to block off all the attacks. Sally retreated for a while, smiled coldly, and said, "The Heavenly Abyss Annihilation Armor is really powerful. However, to think that it has landed in the hands of a demon like you. Today, I'm going to rip this armor off from your body." Fang Xingjian looked at the small, charred mark on his finger and said calmly, "And who are you? Why are you stopping me?" "Knight Association Arbitrator Sally." Sally stared at Fang Xingjian and said, "Have you forgotten what you did in the great western city so quickly?" However, Fang Xingjian was more concerned about the 4 people who had escaped. Gao Tu and the others also seemed to be stunned by Sally's sudden appearance. All of them stopped their escape and gathered together. Rakshasi said coldly, "You're still planning to escape? That idiotic woman has already chased after us. We can kill her here and frame Fang Xingjian for it. There's no point in doing that. It'll be a waste of time to get the higher-ups to send more people down, and it'll give more time for the rebirth sword technique to spread. Humph. Moreover, do you think that we can kill this woman so easily?" Gao Tu said calmly, "But we can help her capture Fang Xingjian." How could Gao Tu not be furious to be forced to escape by a junior? Moreover, getting Sally to capture Fang Xingjian was very compatible with their plan. As they spoke, the 4 of them gradually surrounded Fang Xingjian. "Arbitrator Sally, right?" Gao Tu chuckled and said, "Let us help you capture Fang Xingjian." Fang Xingjian threw a glance at the 5 people surrounding him and said to Sally, "Have you misunderstood something?" "Earlier in the great western city, I guess you can say that I've saved your subordinate." "Save my subordinate?" The scenes of the ruins, the injured people, and the dead Baroque sword Marcus flashed in Sally's mind. Violent fury surged up her head, and her light wings turned into a pure gold color. "Do you think that I'm an idiot?" Sally's eyes were encompassed by a pure gold glow. "I'll have a good talk with you after I break your limbs." Fang Xingjian raised his brows and said, "Woman, have you eaten sh tea? Scram immediately. Otherwise, I'll kill you as well." Rakshas's daughter also let out a blood-curdling scream as her entire thigh fell toward a small hill. Fang Xingjian had only leaped halfway when another scorching aura soared into the sky. Gao Tu, who was covered in flames, transformed once again. The giant spirit sex killing technique, molten body, was activated at full power. Endless lava gushed out from the pores on his body, and in that instant he turned into a lava giant with a height of 10 meters. It was a transformation-type killing technique similar to Blood Rampage. "How is it, Fang Xingjian? Are you regretting coming here?" Amidst the maniacal laughter, the huge lava palm grabbed Fang Xingjian's body. With a force that could crush a tank, or with a high temperature that could melt rocks, Fang Xingjian's body was completely engulfed. However, the huge lava palm only paused for a moment. In the next moment, countless sword light soared into the sky, and the huge lava palm exploded. With a dash, Fang Xingjian once again appeared on a floating rock several hundred meters away. However, before he could catch his breath, Sally, who had spread out her 6 crimson golden light wings, had once again appeared before him in a flash. The light sword in her hand contracted and then expanded. Killing technique, Light of Judgment. A white light cannon with a radius of 2 meters gushed out, covering Fang Xingjian's entire body without any reservations. It drew a long line of light in the sky, heating up the air several kilometers away. It also heated up the air around Fang Xingjian to a temperature of over 10,000 degrees Celsius. The entire floating mountain was vaporized in that instant, and Fang Xingjian was sent tumbling toward the ground. With a loud bang, with the point of impact as the center, layers of soil ripples appeared in the surroundings. The violent power created a crater. As Fang Xingjian got up slowly, the crater under his feet once again trembled and floated upward due to the lack of gravity. Simultaneously, the 5 conferred knights once again descended from the sky, landing around him and surrounding him. Fang Xingjian rubbed his neck and stood up, seemingly unscathed. Yao Tu grinned. So this is the Heavenly Abyss Annihilation Armor. It's really an equipment that makes one envious. It's such a waste for you to be wearing it. Rakshasi stared at Fang Xingjian with a smug expression. Fang Xingjian, do you understand now? Your defeat is inevitable. It's because your actions will make you an enemy of the entire world. Sally swept out with the light sword in her hand, and her cold words contained burning fury. Surrender yourself. Even the Heavenly Abyss Annihilation Armor doesn't have unlimited defense. If you don't wish to be beaten to death by us, then surrender. Although I detest your filthy soul, I'll still give you a chance to be judged fairly. Fang Xingjian did not reply and merely looked at the few conferred knights calmly. He let out a breath and said, "What you guys said makes a lot of sense. If I were to rely solely on my own powers, I'd probably have to pay a considerable price in order to defeat you guys." With that, he squatted down slightly. His skin trembled as if something was bulging up from within. Therefore, I'll let the two monsters in my body have a spar with you guys. It's just as well that I want to test out their prowess. As he spoke, the skin all over his body trembled and changed, turning into a set of black armor. The armor then went through a series of transformations, turning from an inconspicuous black armor into a set of faint golden armor that reflected a metallic glow. Light that was like flames continued to jump about on the surface of his body. In void space, countless powers such as magnetism, heat, and other energies gushed into his body. White light formations appeared one after another on his elbows, soles of his feet, knees, and other areas. They were auxiliary battlefields, such as acceleration field, great force field, alignment field, and many others. Be careful. Don't let him unleash the full power of the Heavenly Abyss Annihilation Armor. Sally let out a furious bellow, and the light wings on her back spread out once again, turning into several tins of light swords that lined up on her back. All the light swords were aimed at Fang Xingjian, and each light sword instantly expanded into a light pillar with a thickness of 4 meters. They turned into streams of light judgment, encompassing Fang Xingjian. Chapter 333. Gao Tu let out a furious bellow as well. Suppress him. His level is too low, and he won't be able to activate the Heavenly Abyss Annihilation Armor for long. As he spoke, the huge lava giant extended its palms, slapping out fiercely toward Fang Xingjian's position for both sides. The scorching air currents were like high-temperature steam that was pushed over first, burning and distorting the places it passed by. Rakshasi also unleashed an explosive power. Her regenerated thighs swelled up abruptly, and at the next moment, she kept on kicking the atmosphere, pushing it away. Extremely condensed powers compressed the atmosphere, forming streams of atmospheric dragons that could blast over 10 streets into the sky. They struck out toward Fang Xingjian. The twins, Zhang Zhua and Zhang Yu, who had been standing by, also made their moves. Craziness, death, despair. Like a lunatic's diary, information currents ignored all attacks and encompassed toward Fang Xingjian's position. Ordinary humans would probably turn into lunatics just from the impact of such information currents. Even those at the night level would suffer a mental blow and be unable to recover from it. If conferred knights did not have sufficient willpower, they might even suffer a mental breakdown. Layers of terrifying attacks swept to and fro, as if there were a series of attacks from over 100 bombers. The floating island under Fang Xingjian's feet was instantly vaporized, and light and heat encompassed everything. The waves of the ether particles also became extremely chaotic at this moment, causing everyone present to be unable to sense what was going on. Even I would be seriously injured by such an attack. The lava giant that Gao Tu had turned in to watch the situation quietly. He shouldn't be able to make it, right? Sally's brows furrowed, and an unprecedented sense of unease welled up in her heart, making her feel slightly flustered. What's that? Something's coming out. This feeling is as if several hundred snakes are crawling on my body. What on earth is going on? Amidst the gradually extinguishing light and heat, Fang Xingjian's voice rang out slowly. Although it was still his original voice, the coldness and brutality in his tone had increased by over 10 times. 1 second. You guys have 1 second to think about your last words. Potential points started to be depleted, and boundaries negation was activated. 100,000 potential points were depleted, and the Heaven's Volition Sword Intent was activated. The Heaven's Volition Sword Intent turned into an overwhelming aura and soared into the sky. In an instant, it encompassed Fang Xingjian's entire consciousness, then extended out and filled up Fang Xingjian's entire body. Endless information, countless sword techniques, and countless experiences surged up in Fang Xingjian's mind. Along with the endless pain, his eyes became bloodshot. Simultaneously, a terrifying power exploded in his body like a balloon. Regardless of whether it was heat energy, light energy, electricity, magnetism, or even ether particles, all of them had their freedom taken away by an absolute will, and their powers were all seized away. Whoosh! A black figure first appeared before Gao Tu, and then the world seemed to shatter in Gao Tu's eyes. A stream of information flowed into Gao Tu's mind. He could even see the hint of disdain in Fang Xingjian's eyes. It also caused Fang Xingjian's voice to ring out in his consciousness. If you don't die from this attack of mine, I'll spare your pathetic life. Terror ingurgitation was finally unleashed. An extremely turbulent and violent power came slamming down along with Fang Xingjian's sword attack. The lava exploded, and over 10,000 tons of lava filled up the entire sky. It was as if fireworks were raining down. Blood splattered out from all over Gao Tu's body, and then he collided into the ground like a meteor. Simultaneously, a wave of electromagnetic waves that were so powerful that they were visible to the naked eye swept out. The level 40 Thunder Hell's Word was activated, and Gao Tu felt the ground under his feet pushing up abruptly. Simultaneously, the floating islands, which had returned to their gravitational state, descended from the sky. They formed a huge sword in midair that was the size of a small mountain, slashing down on his head. Above him was a mountain crashing down, and below him was the pressure from a magnitude 7 or 8 earthquake. Gao Tu let out a furious bellow, and firepower shot out from all over his body, exploding like a fuel air explosive. Only then did he manage to fend off the descending mountain. At the instant he caught hold of the small mountain, more than half of the bones in his body shattered, and blood splattered out like a fountain. It was as if he had been sandwiched between 2 huge mountains, one above and the other below, and he could no longer move. As Fang Xingjian's sword attack slammed out, the terror ingurgitation was completed. Countless towering trees, hills of various sizes, and rocks came raining down from the sky. Up to this point, Fang Xingjian had only spent 0.2 seconds. At 15 times that of supersonic speed, the rain of rocks falling from the sky seemed to have come to a standstill before him. He took a few steps forward and appeared behind Rakshasi, as if he had teleported. His sword pierced toward the back of Rakshasi's waist like a bolt of lightning. However, in this world that seemed to have come to a standstill, Rakshasi turned her head abruptly and swept out with her long legs, bringing along surging forces. Her top speed might not be as fast as Fang Xingjian's, but it was not as if she was completely defenseless. However, when she turned her head, she only managed to kick an afterimage. At the same time, a stream of information flowed into her brain. Do you know how fast light is? In that instant, Rakshasi could only see 6 light spots magnifying rapidly in her eyes, filling up her entire field of vision like 6 suns. The level 40 Zenith Light Sword formation was activated at full power, and with the reinforcement from the Heaven's Volition Sword Intent, its prowess was over 10 times stronger than what Fang Xingjian would normally be able to control on his own. Countless light swords swept past Rakshasi's body. They were not slashing, but heating up vaporizing the water in her body in that instant. Ah! Agonizing cries rang out from Rakshasi's throat. She had already dashed out a distance of over 100 meters as she regenerated. However, no matter how she darted left and right, no matter how much she accelerated, she was unable to dodge the light sword attacks. Her entire body was being heated up incessantly, and the water in her eyeballs was disintegrated. Her blood turned into boiling steam, and her lungs and heart were all burned into charcoal. Amidst the continuous struggles and agonizing cries, Rakshasi gradually came to a stop. Only the slight throbbing of her brain waves indicated that she could still be considered to be alive. During this period of time, when she was struggling, Fang Xingjian's body flashed and once again appeared before Zhang Zhuo and Zhang Yu. The two twins grabbed onto Fang Xingjian, and the rubbish in their minds gushed out incessantly toward Fang Xingjian's consciousness like a virus. Amidst the information currents, the duo's furious bellows could be heard. Feel our pain. However, at the next moment, the Heaven's Volition soared intent in the center of Fang Xingjian's consciousness throbbed like a heart, exploding fiercely. It was as if there were countless sharp swords slashing the information currents into dust. An even more powerful martial will swept out. Unorthodox methods that can't even withstand a single blow. Swoosh, 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 soft swoosh sounds radiated out in the air, and over 100 streams of ether sword ripples slashed out, slashing the two twins into large pieces of minced meat, according to the weaknesses pointed out by the unparalleled sword intent, Extremity Finger. After seriously injuring Gao Tu and Rakshasi consecutively and killing Zhang Zhuo and Zhang Yu instantly, only 7 seconds had passed. Fang Xingjian turned to look in Sally's direction, only to discover that she was charging over while bellowing furiously. The pure golden light wings on her back were burning fiercely, bringing up bits of pale white flames. It was only at the moment when Sally dashed over that Fang Xingjian had the time to get a feel of his current condition. Ether synchronization rate of 100%? This kind of perception of information. So much information. I can see the gaps in space. I can see the changes in the future skills. I can sense the flow of time. Chapter 334. In the last 2 seconds of the Heaven's Volition sword intent, Sally had already dashed up to Fang Xingjian. Under Fang Xingjian's Heaven's perception, everything about Sally was revealed. Her body structure, the secrets of her bloodline, the light wings that had been modified at level 25 with the help of her bloodline's powers, as well as the fury that continued to burn in her brain. There were even some scenes that Sally would experience in the future. The layers of light swords turned into a net of light and came crashing down. However, Fang Xingjian's right hand was like a sharp sword, piercing through the net of light, passing through all the gaps in the net and grabbing Sally's neck without any mercy. Sally, who was charging forward at full speed, only felt a huge force pressing down on her neck, causing her entire body to come to a stop in an instant. To be able to stop her from moving at a speed that was over 10 times that of supersonic speed at a distance of just a few centimeters. How powerful was the reaction force? It had completely surpassed what Sally could endure. She felt as if her entire body had been knocked down by a huge mountain. A large area of her internal organs was displaced, and her blood vessels were like broken water pipes bursting out. What was even worse was that under the huge impact, her brain had smashed into her skull, resulting in an intense concussion. This caused her consciousness to be in a mess, and she was unable to react to what had happened. At the next moment, 12 streams of ether sword ripples swept out consecutively, slashing off Sally's forelimbs. Blood spurted out from the wounds like running water, turning the surroundings into a pool of blood. It was only then that the Heaven's Volition sword intense outburst gradually came to an end and dissipated. It curled up once again and returned to the center of Fang Xingjian's consciousness, surrounded by all the skill seeds. The feeling of being omniscient and able to see through everything faded away from Fang Xingjian's body. The strong feeling of disparity continued to stimulate his consciousness. Divine level? No, it only allowed me to possess a portion of a level 29 Confer Knight's powers. But it's really very strong. Teacher James, Sword Saint, the First Prince. Do they possess such overwhelming, no, even stronger powers? Fang Xingjian glanced at the dizzy Sally and tossed her to the ground like a piece of trash. From the corner of his eyes, he noticed that Rakshas's daughter was staring at him with her eyes slightly open. When she saw Fang Xingjian looking at her, her eyes were filled with terror. Unfortunately, her body was severely burned and she could not move, much less escape. Yet, her body was still trembling uncontrollably. On the other side, Gao Tu was still holding up the stone sword that had descended from the sky like a small mountain. His eyes were tightly shut, and he was like a statue. In reality, he was no longer breathing. He had died from exhaustion. Sally trembled as she raised her head. The recoil from the previous attack had ruptured most of the blood vessels all over her body. Even though they were already recovering, blood was still flowing out of her eyes, nose, mouth, and ears. Sally struggled to see the situation around her, and she opened her mouth while trembling. "What are you doing? What the hell did you do? You've killed 3 Confer Knights." Looking at Sally, whose broken arms and legs were recovering with great difficulty, and whose brain was still in a state of concussion, unable to maintain her waves and mental cultivation method, Fang Xingjian looked down at her and said calmly, "If you want to kill me, then kill me. Woman, if it wasn't for your identity, you'd be dead by now. You're pretty strong. The remains can be used to make a good set of armor. Demons, unforgivable." Sally let out a furious curse and opened her eyes. 2 streams of white high-energy light gushed out, engulfing Fang Xingjian's head. However, Fang Xingjian's head was still covered by the Heavenly Abyss Annihilation Armor's helmet. He only felt a slight warmth, but did not receive any injuries. It was true that Sally was very powerful. She could move through spatial gaps in an instant, had various light speed and high-temperature sword techniques, and had a pair of light wings that kept on absorbing the energy from ether particles. After being shot, Fang Xingjian kicked Sally's face, smashing her face and sending her flying over 100 meters away. She crashed into a huge rock and only came to a stop after tumbling over 10 rounds. Sally said furiously, "Kill me. If you don't kill me, be it 10 years or 100 years, I'll definitely be able to catch you." "Woman, hasn't anyone told you that your character is extremely detestable?" Fang Xingjian stomped down on Sally's back, causing her body, which had just managed to stand up, to sink into the soil once again. She even swallowed a large amount of soil and dust. "I've saved your subordinates and chased away the assassins who attacked the house, but you keep on bothering me. Do you really think that I won't kill the arbitrators?" Fang Xingjian put out one of his hands and grabbed onto one of the light wings on Sally's back, pulling it back forcefully. Sally, who had a determined expression like an iron-blooded warrior, trembled and cried out in agony when her wings were tugged. Clearly, her light wings were her weak point. However, the words that Fang Xingjian had said earlier rang out in Sally's mind. What's going on? What nonsense is he spouting? Fang Xingjian exerted force, and the light wings became extremely distorted and pulled. Intense pain continued to be transmitted to Sally's brain, causing her to cry out in agony. It was a pity that her entire head was pressed into the soil. She kept on struggling, but could only let out whimpering sounds. Fang Xingjian continued, "Arbitrators? You don't know anything at all. The Rebirth Sword Technique is a sword technique that will change the entire world. And you're just someone from the upper echelon who is afraid of change, someone who is corrupted and blinded by benefits. They've just sent you a knife. If you want to know what the Rebirth Sword Technique is like, won't you find out by practicing it yourself?" A soft tearing sound rang out, and a crack appeared on Sally's wings. Her expression immediately became one of extreme agony and savageness. With a sound, under Fang Xingjian's great tugging force, the entire light wings were completely torn off. Sally trembled crazily and started to struggle. Feng Xingjian was unable to suppress her for a moment, and it was clear that Sally was in extreme pain. It was only after an entire minute that Sally stopped. However, her aura had become extremely weak. Casually tossing the light wings onto the ground, Feng Xingjian headed in the direction of Rakshasi. Arbitrator Sally, I'll prove to you that there's no problem with the rebirth sword technique 3 days later. But within these 3 days, if you do anything else to disturb me. With that, Feng Xingjian abruptly turned his head back and met Sally's gaze. Their chi waves seemed to be clashing intensely, and there seemed to be some disturbance in the air. Feng Xingjian continued, if that's the case, then that earlier attack will be my final warning. With that, he continued to walk toward Rakshasi. Rakshasi moved her body bit by bit, and her breathing was very weak as she said, don't come over. Don't come near me. Don't come over. The way Feng Xingjian had torn off the light wings earlier had clearly frightened her. Sally raised her palm with great difficulty. Right now, the bones in her palm had just finished growing, and there were hints of muscles slowly growing out. She shouted out in a hoarse voice, wait, don't go. Say what you just said clearly. However, Feng Xingjian just lifted Rakshasi up, slung her over his shoulder, and left. Sally could only watch as Feng Xingjian's back gradually disappeared. Feng, Xing, Jian, don't go. Come back here. Her palm, which had just finished growing muscles, clenched toward the ground, leaving behind a large claw mark. At the same time, a large amount of blood burst out from the newly grown muscles and blood vessels. Suddenly, her eyes lit up. Feng Xingjian had really returned. Feng Xingjian walked up to Gao Tu and brought away the corpse of this conferred knight. I almost forgot that a level 25 conferred knight is very valuable. Chapter 335. They returned to the regional academy's sacred land as if they were taking a stroll. Head of department James was already standing at the entrance. Looking at Feng Xingjian, Rakshasi, who was on Feng Xingjian's shoulders, and Gao Tu, who was in Feng Xingjian's hands, James said, Xingjian, what on earth is going on? Someone said that you've launched a surprise attack on the arbitration team? Therefore, Feng Xingjian recounted everything that had happened that night. After hearing it, James said, so that's how it is. They've already sent people over? He threw a glance at Rakshasi, who was on Feng Xingjian's shoulders, and said, if you trust me, then hand this woman over to us. Feng Xingjian did not know much about interrogations and was just thinking about how to get information out of Rakshasi. Hearing this, he said, I want to listen from the side. Just then, Rakshasi started trembling. Do you think that I'll say anything? What can I say? From the moment you caught me, I was already doomed. As she spoke, she started to evaporate and disappear. James dashed forward, but he could only grab a handful of powder. Rakshasi instantly turned into dust and dissipated into the world. A level 24 conferred knight had died, just like that. Looking at Gao Tu, who was at the side, he seemed to have also started to evaporate. James immediately slashed out with his palms, chopping off Gao Tu's upper body. He then pressed his other hand on it, performing some secret technique and finally leaving half of Gao Tu's body behind. James said, it seems that an expert has left a martial will in his body and silenced him the moment he noticed that something was wrong. In the past, only the military did this so that the enemy would not be able to get their hands on the remains' divine weapon. It's a pity that there's only half of it left. He then patted Feng Xingjian's shoulder and said, don't worry. As long as you get through this arbitration, they can forget about dealing with you unless they use force. But which one of them would dare to use force in our great western region? Simultaneously, a hint of pride flashed in James's eyes. As for this arbitration, we've already gone through it. There definitely won't be any problems. Oh, right. What do you plan on doing with these remains? Feng Xingjian shrugged indifferently. Sell it for me. I need the money. On the other side of the hospital, Sally's eyes would occasionally glance at heaven-shaking Sword Potter, who was lying on the hospital bed. Her eyes were filled with confusion and hesitation. After heaven-shaking Sword Potter arrived at the hospital, he sank into an unknown coma. Other than the three kids whose internal organs had deteriorated, everyone else was either dead or in a coma from serious injuries. Due to the lack of witnesses, the Great Western region refused to arrest Fang Xingjian. As for the few confer knights whom Fang Xingjian had killed, she had also gotten someone to check on their information. However, they did not seem to be registered confer knights. What Fang Xingjian had said that day was still lingering in Sally's ears. She touched her shoulder, and the intense pain seemed to strike again, causing her body to tremble uncontrollably. Is what he said true? Just as Sally was thinking about the entire matter, someone suddenly walked in and handed her a document. "Madam, this is a document sent by the association." Sally opened the document and started reading it. Her pupils contracted abruptly, as if there were raging flames burning in them. In the document were the data of over 100 knights and knight apprentices. All of them had suffered varying degrees of damage to their internal organs after cultivating the rebirth sword technique. The data in the document was very detailed, including each cultivator's data, including their level, skill level, age, physical attributes, as well as their daily diet and living conditions. Is this the latest data collected by the association? Looking at the data, Sally clenched her fists tightly. As expected, there's still a problem with the rebirth sword technique. With this document, the arbitrator Fang Xingjian will definitely lose. The attack yesterday might not have been done by you, but there's really a problem with the rebirth sword technique. I definitely won't allow this sword technique to be passed down. Early the next morning, Fang Xingjian was still cultivating his sword techniques in the sacred land. Although he had not managed to get much information from the surprise attack yesterday, he had still managed to cut off one of the hands that the other party had extended over. However, Fang Xingjian had yet to make a decision as to whether he should find a chance to study the situation of the three apprentices. Just then, another person arrived at the Great Western Region's Regional Academy. In the living room, Fang Xingjian looked at Huang Lin and said in surprise, "Teacher, why have you come? It's because you've caused too much trouble this time around. I'm here to help you." Huang Lin said as he took out a letter from his chest. "Take a look. This is the Guardian King's reply." Fang Xingjian opened the letter and realized that it was completely blank. However, with his heaven's perception, a tremendous amount of information surged toward him very quickly. Many of the letters from conferred knights were usually infused with information. After he finished reading the information, there seemed to be a voice ringing out in Fang Xingjian's mind. "Don't worry, child. This time around, I'll be your witness." Hearing that extremely amiable voice that sounded like that of a pure elder, Fang Xingjian's eyes opened wide. To think that the Holy Orzen had personally left a martial will that possessed a certain level of intelligence in it. It was like the information remnant in the Heavenly Abyss Annihilation Armor, or the Heaven's Volition Sword Intent in the Dragon Scale. However, it was more complete, and its intelligence seemed to be higher as well. Fang Xingjian said, "To think that the Holy Orzen would personally help me? In this martial technique's grading plan. Teacher, do you understand it? You must participate in this plan. This is a rare opportunity. How much wealth does the church have? They're so rich that they're overflowing with wealth. Only someone as extravagant as them would be able to come up with a plan that has no direct benefits, but can benefit the future generations. This is equivalent to giving out money and secret manuals for you to cultivate. It's a great thing." Fang Xingjian nodded. Even the martial technique's grading plan would not start so soon. However, the Holy Orzen was willing to testify for him, and the rebirth sword technique was something that could be seen very soon. With this letter, Fang Xingjian was confident that he would not lose in the arbitration this time around. Huang Lin added, "Oh, right? The Guardian King has infused information into this letter, which means that he's left behind his martial will. Although it's not much, it's still information from a divine-level expert. It possesses great abilities and can save your life at a critical moment." There were no problems with the arbitration. Therefore, for the next 3 days, Fang Xingjian did not bother with the arbitration. Instead, he hid in the sacred land to cultivate his sword arts as usual. Sword Saint Sasa also felt sincerely happy that Fang Xingjian did not come to the Sword Tower's research room. Sasa led several tens of experts to work overtime in their research, and there was almost no time for rest. It was because he knew that after the arbitration 3 days later, James and Hops would probably not allow him to take another step closer to the dragon scale. After 3 days of hard work, in addition to the hard work he had put in for over half a month, Sasa finally deciphered all the words on the dragon scale and started to absorb the sword intent. It was not as complicated as the real Heaven's Volition sword intent, and Sasa easily obtained the sword intent that Fang Xingjian had left behind in the dragon scale. Gue Mei pursues Wu Wang. Wu Wang pursues the same person, and the same person pursues the same person. From A to C, from C to Gung, from Gung to Gue. From Z to Cho, from Chun to Si, from Wu to Wei. From Feng to Lei, from Shan to Zhe, from fire to water. From Qian to Kuan, from Zhen to Ui, from Li to Sun. From 3 to 5, from 5 to 9. There was no power, no treasures, and not even any specific moves. It was just a sword theory. Solitary 9 swords? Breaking through all the martial techniques in the world? Sasa slowly comprehended the contents. At one moment, his eyes were filled with ecstasy, then puzzlement, and at the next moment they turned into vexation. His entire consciousness had sunk deep into the sword intent. Although he had deciphered the words on the dragon scale, he still did not know much about Chinese characters. Therefore, when he saw the mental cultivation method of the solitary 9 swords, he was still in a state where he could not understand most of it. Usually, when he saw the mental cultivation method of the solitary 9 swords, he would definitely scoff at it. However, the Chinese characters, as well as the mental cultivation method that he had obtained from the dragon scale, made him feel as if he had obtained a priceless treasure. You're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.